We often convince ourselves that we have evolved far beyond our primitive fears, feeling perfectly safe behind locked doors and the bright lights of modern cities. But take a moment to ask yourself, have you ever felt that sudden chill down your spine? That deep gut-level instinct whispering that someone or something is watching you from the shadows, even when your logic tells you you're in the most desolate, empty place on Earth? The three stories of Chris, Paul, and Sam are not just terrifying anecdotes about deep woods or jagged mountains. They are a stark testament to the truth that humans walk a razor-thin line between reality and the unknown. From the invisible gaze piercing the back of a park ranger in the dead of night, to the mountain lion tracking the exact footsteps of a weary hiker, to the sinister message, "Sleep well." Scratched into the dust of a car window by a human predator, these encounters serve as a grim reminder that we are not the masters of the food chain we think we are. When the silence of nature becomes heavy and your survival instincts begin to scream a warning, listen. In this world, the moment you become complacent about your own safety is the moment you transform from an observer into a target. Behind every corner, every rustle of dry leaves, lies a darkness waiting to be unveiled. Are you truly prepared to face the raw, unvarnished reality? Because behind every case, there is a world that only reveals its truth to those brave enough to confront the darkest, strangest corners of life. We like to think that we've evolved past the need for primitive survival instincts. We live in houses with locked doors, we have cell phones, and we've conquered the top of the food chain. But for 200,000 years, our ancestors survived by listening to a whisper in their subconscious, that prickling sensation on the back of your neck when you're being watched, even when your eyes tell you that there is absolutely nobody there. Most of the time, we brush it off as paranoia. But what if that feeling wasn't a glitch in your brain, but a warning? In the summer of 2007, Chris was a park ranger in the dense, sprawling forests of southeastern Pennsylvania. He loved the job, mostly. The hiking, the isolation, the quiet majesty of the woods, that was his element. But every job comes with its share of tedium, and for Chris, that meant the late-night office work, hours spent hunched over paperwork while the forest outside breathed in the dark. One August night, the atmosphere in the office was unusually heavy. Chris was there with his supervisor, Mike. Around midnight, Mike realized they needed some equipment from a tool shed located about a half-mile down the access road. He grabbed his keys, told Chris he'd be back in 15 minutes, and disappeared into the trees. As soon as the truck's headlights faded into the darkness, the silence of the office felt suddenly oppressive. Chris decided he needed a break. He pushed open the heavy front door and stepped out into the humid night air. The office sat at the edge of a large, gravelly staff parking lot. Beyond that, the woods began a wall of black pine and thick brush that seemed to swallow the moonlight. Chris sat on the front steps, staring aimlessly toward the tree line. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, no chirping insects. It was perfectly, unnervingly still. And then, it hit him. It started as a subtle shift in the air, a sense of being intruded upon. His skin crawled. He felt the weight of a gaze pressing against his back, coming from somewhere out in the dark. Instinctively, he whipped his head around, expecting to see Mike standing there, or perhaps a coworker playing a prank. But the office was empty. It was just him. He turned back to the forest, his heart rate picking up. He scanned the tree line, his eyes straining against the shadows. Nothing. No movement. No snapping twigs. Yet, the feeling remained an icy prickle on his spine that screamed, "Leave now." Chris wasn't the type to get spooked easily. He spent his life in these woods. He knew the difference between a deer and a predator. He told himself he was just tired, that the silence was playing tricks on his mind. But the instinct was too loud to ignore. He decided to do a quick sweep. He walked down the steps and moved through the parking lot, checking behind the parked trucks. The lot was deserted. He kept walking until he stood at the very edge of the woods. He looked into the black void of the trees, feeling like he was standing on the precipice of something wrong. He waited. He listened. Again, nothing. It's just in your head, he told himself. Go back inside. He turned his back on the forest to walk back to the office. He took 3 steps, and then the world exploded into action. Whoosh! A sound tore through the air, inches from his left ear. It was the distinct, sharp hiss of something heavy and wooden spinning through the air, a projectile thrown with brutal overhand force. It missed his head by a hair's breadth and clattered into the dirt behind him. Chris didn't think. He reacted. He threw himself onto the gravel, scrambling into a defensive crouch, his eyes locked on the tree line. His pulse was thundering in his ears. He waited for a charge, for a footstep, for a voice. But the forest remained dead silent. He scrambled to his feet, backpedaling toward the office, his eyes darting frantically across the dark. He snatched up a heavy stick, ready to defend himself, but he couldn't find the object that had been thrown at him. He scanned the ground, but in the moonless shadows of the trees, it was like the projectile had vanished into thin air. He didn't wait to find it. He sprinted the remaining distance to the office, slammed the door shut, and threw the deadbolt. He was shaking, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. 20 minutes later, the roar of an engine broke the silence. Mike's truck came tearing up the access road, tires kicking up gravel, headlights swerving wildly. The truck screeched to a halt, and Mike vaulted out, running toward the office with a frantic urgency. Chris unlocked the door, ready to explain what had just happened, but the words died in his throat the moment he saw Mike's face. Mike was pale, his eyes wide and unfocused, his movements jittery and erratic. "What happened?" Chris asked. Mike didn't answer right away. He paced the small room, his hands trembling. Finally, he looked at Chris. "I went to the shed," he said, his voice tight. "I was inside getting the gear when the hair on my arm stood up. I got that feeling like someone was staring through the back of my skull." Chris stared at him, chills breaking out across his skin. "I looked everywhere," Mike continued. "I checked inside the shed, behind it, around the perimeter. I was alone. But I couldn't shake it. I felt like prey." Mike took a shaky breath. "I grabbed the stuff as fast as I could and ran for the truck. Just as I started to drive away, I heard footsteps behind the shed. Running footsteps. I didn't even look back. I just floored it." Mike looked down at his shaking hands. "But right before I turned the corner to leave, I looked in the side mirror. I saw him. A man standing right at the edge of the woods, stepping into the shadows. He wasn't a hiker. He wasn't supposed to be there." Chris finally spoke. "Mike, something was thrown at me." From the trees. They sat in the office for the rest of the night, backs to the wall, watching the door. They didn't sleep. Every creak of the building sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind felt like an intruder. The next morning, they filed a report, but the woods were empty. The man was gone. They never found the object that had been thrown, and they never found out who was hiding in the trees. To this day, neither of them can explain it, but they learned the hard way: when your subconscious tells you that you aren't alone, you should listen. Because in the deep, dark silence of the forest, your instincts are the only thing keeping you from becoming part of the shadows. And if that instinct can sense danger we can't see, sometimes it's because something out there is already watching and waiting. The story of the park ranger serves as a chilling reminder that our survival instincts are more than just superstition. They are the ancient, silent alarms hardwired into our DNA to keep us alive when we step into the unknown. But what happens when you're not just being watched by a stranger, but hunted by something that sees you not as a human, but as food? That is exactly what Paul found out in the remote heart of Utah, far from civilization, where the wilderness plays by a much harsher set of rules. In the summer of 2015, Paul, an experienced outdoorsman, set out on a 7-day solo backpacking trip through a place known as Dark Canyon Wilderness. It's an unforgiving, spectacular landscape where the steep rock walls are so high they block out the sun for most of the day, earning the area its name. It's a place where you can go for a week without seeing another living soul, a place where the silence is absolute, and where, if you make a mistake, there is no one around to hear you scream. On his final day, Paul was exhausted but feeling accomplished. About a mile into a morning hike, he stumbled upon a massive set of elk antlers lying in the brush. They were beautiful, a perfect prize for his trip, so he lashed the 15-pound rack to his pack and pushed on. It seemed like a good idea at the time, but as the hours wore on, the weight became a burden. He found himself moving slower, his muscles screaming, and before he knew it, he had depleted his water supply. Dehydrated and desperate, Paul reached a plateau where he planned to camp. He dropped his heavy pack, shed the antlers, and wandered off to find a source of water. Miraculously, he found a stagnant, murky pool. It was far from ideal, but he figured he could boil it. As he set up his tent and started a small fire, a thought occurred to him. If there was standing water here, there had to be a natural spring nearby. Why settle for boiling gray sludge when he could find fresh running water? He left his gear, including his bottles, at the campsite and began trekking up the mountain. He hiked for about half a mile before finding a beautiful, clear spring. He dropped to his knees and drank greedily, but as he finished, a cold wave of dread washed over him. He reached for his belt to fill his bottles, only to realize he had left everything at his camp. He cursed his luck. He had to go all the way back. As he turned to head back down the mountain, the atmosphere changed. The forest, which had felt peaceful moments ago, now felt heavy. Every rustle of a leaf sounded like a footstep. Every snap of a twig sounded like a deliberate movement. He felt an intense, prickling sensation on his neck, the distinct feeling that something was behind him, tracking his every move. He kept turning his head, expecting to see a stranger, a hiker, anyone. But there was nothing. He reached his camp, gathered his bottles, and felt a strong urge to just pack up and leave. But he needed the water. He wouldn't last the hike out without it. To calm his nerves, he grabbed a thick, heavy branch, a makeshift club, and started back up toward the spring. The anxiety returned instantly, thicker and more suffocating than before. He felt like he was being measured. He felt like he was being hunted. He filled the bottles as quickly as he could and turned to head back to camp. As he descended a small rock face and landed on the dirt path he had traveled just minutes earlier, he stopped dead in his tracks. His blood turned to ice. There, pressed into the dirt, were the fresh, clear prints of a mountain lion. But they weren't just on the trail. They were positioned directly between his own footprints, perfectly synchronized with his gait. The predator had been tracking his steps from inches away, keeping itself perfectly obscured in the shadows of the brush. It hadn't just been watching him, it had been waiting for the right moment to strike. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The elk antlers on his backpack hadn't just been a souvenir, they were a beacon. The mountain lion had likely seen the rack of antlers and the weight on his back, and decided that Paul was an elk, weak, struggling, and easy prey. Paul didn't look back. He sprinted the half-mile back to his campsite, dove into his tent, and zipped it shut, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He huddled in the dark, clutching his knife, listening to every vibration in the night. The mountain lion remained somewhere out there, lurking in the dark, silent and deadly. He didn't sleep a wink. He waited until the sun finally crested the horizon, brought his gear out, and moved with a speed he hadn't thought possible, finally reaching the safety of his car. He had entered the canyon seeking solitude, but he left with a terrifying lesson. In the wild, you are never truly alone, and sometimes you are not the top of the food chain. But as terrifying as that night was, Paul could at least take comfort in one thing. The creature hunting him was only following its nature. It didn't lie, it didn't plan, and it didn't take pleasure in fear. Humans, however, are a different story. While the terror of being hunted by an animal is a primal fear, there is something far more chilling about the realization that you are being stalked by another human being. In the vast, desolate stretches of the American West, where legends of lost gold and mysterious disappearances are woven into the very fabric of the landscape, 17-year-old Sam learned that lesson the hardest way possible. In April 2020, Sam, an avid outdoorsman, decided to tackle an 8-mile loop in Arizona's Superstition Mountains. The range is infamous, named for the endless tales of mysterious deaths and vanishings that have plagued it for decades. Locals tend to avoid the deeper canyons, but Sam, who prided himself on his knowledge of the area, wasn't the superstitious type. He planned a solo overnight trip, figuring he'd hike 4 miles in, camp under the stars, and return the next morning. Things went wrong before the hike even began. Traffic and harsh road conditions delayed him significantly, and he didn't reach the trailhead until 5:45 p.m. With the sun already beginning to dip, Sam knew he was cutting it close. He considered turning back, but his confidence pushed him onward. He thought he could move fast enough to cover at least a few miles before true darkness set in. But the terrain was unforgiving, and the trail grew treacherous under the fading light. Within hours, the desert was swallowed by absolute blackness. Using his flashlight, Sam found a clearing about 30 feet off the path, a suitable spot for the night. He noticed an old, weathered fire pit, confirming that others had camped here before. He didn't bring a tent. Instead, he rigged a simple tarp between the pine trees, unrolled his sleeping bag, and got a fire crackling. As he sat there, eating a can of beans in the small circle of warmth, the silence of the mountains began to feel heavy. It wasn't the peaceful silence of nature, it was a pressurized, watching silence. Then, it happened. A rock about the size of a marble whistled through the air and landed with a sharp clack at his feet. Sam froze. He looked toward the tree line, but the fire had blinded his night vision. Beyond the flames, there was only impenetrable darkness. He scanned the trees for 15 minutes, his heart thumping, but heard nothing. He rationalized it. Perhaps a rock had fallen from a cliff, or a branch had shaken it loose. He managed to calm himself down, convinced it was just his imagination playing tricks on his frayed nerves. He crawled into his sleeping bag and eventually drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. He woke hours later to an overwhelming sense of dread. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the air felt cold and wrong. He laid perfectly still, listening. From the darkness, perhaps 30 or 40 meters away, came the distinct sound of rustling leaves. Something was walking, not like an animal, but with the calculated, heavy gait of a person moving through the brush. The sound moved closer, then faded. Sam reached out instinctively to grab his flashlight from the ground beside him. His hand hit nothing but dirt. His stomach dropped. He had placed that light inches from his head before bed. He sat up, his breath hitching, and searched the immediate area. Nothing. He scanned the dark with his eyes, and then a beam of moonlight caught a glint of plastic. About 10 meters away, his flashlight was lying on the ground, pointing back toward his camp. The realization was sickening. Someone had stood over him while he slept, reached down, taken his light, and moved it. It wasn't an accident. It was a lure, a deliberate attempt to draw him away from the safety of his camp and into the dark. Adrenaline surged through him. He didn't move toward the light. Instead, he scrambled to his feet, grabbed his knife, and began frantically throwing every stick and log he could reach onto the dying fire. He needed light. He needed a barrier. He spent the next several hours standing in the center of his campsite, his back to the fire, knife gripped in a white-knuckled fist. Throughout the night, he heard them. Footsteps would approach the edge of the clearing, stop, and then retreat. Every time the fire dimmed, the footsteps grew closer. Every time he stoked the flames, they backed away. It was a terrifying, silent dance that lasted until 3 a.m. when he ran out of firewood. With no more fuel to keep the perimeter lit, Sam stood in the fading light, waiting for the inevitable. At one point, he heard movement just 3 meters away, hidden behind a thick cluster of pine trees. Whoever it was stood there, motionless, waiting for the fire to die. Sam stood there for 2 hours, facing the trees, ready to fight for his life, his mind racing with the image of a shadow emerging from the dark. But the attack never came. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, the footsteps retreated, disappearing into the rugged terrain. Sam didn't pack. He didn't wait. He grabbed his essentials, bolted from the camp, and didn't stop sprinting until he reached his car at the trailhead. He was shaking so violently he could barely get the key in the ignition. He drove 20 miles in total silence, the trauma of the night playing over and over in his mind. He finally pulled into a gas station, desperate for a drink and a moment to breathe. He got out of his car, his legs feeling like lead, and as he walked around the back of the vehicle to get a bottle of water, he stopped. Written in the dust on his back window in clear, mocking letters was a message. Sleep well? Sam realized then that he hadn't been lost in the mountains. He had been hunted. The realization that someone had stalked him, toyed with him, and watched him suffer in fear, and then followed him all the way to his car was a weight he would carry for the rest of his life. He had gone into the Superstition Mountains to prove he was a capable, confident outdoorsman. He left with the terrifying confirmation that in the deep, dark places of the world, there are predators who don't need claws or teeth to be the most dangerous thing in the woods. These stories of Chris, Paul, and Sam serve as more than just unsettling accounts of life in the wild. They are a profound reminder of how fragile our sense of security truly is. We walk through life comforted by the belief that we have outgrown the dangers of the natural world, that our technology and intellect have permanently separated us from the roles of the hunted. Yet, in the quiet of a Pennsylvania forest, the isolation of a Utah canyon, or the shadows of the Superstition Mountains, that illusion dissolves in an instant. What makes these experiences truly haunting isn't just the physical danger, but the realization that we are often being observed long before we even suspect a threat. Whether it is an unseen predator pacing in the brush, or a human shadow lingering at the edge of our camp, the result is the same. The predatory gaze is absolute. These encounters expose the uncomfortable truth that our survival instincts, those ancient pulses deep within our subconscious, are not relics of a bygone era. They are vital, living tools that we have largely learned to ignore in favor of convenience and modern comfort. When we dismiss that inexplicable bad feeling or the sudden cold weight of being watched, we are choosing to ignore the very thing that kept our ancestors alive for millennia. These stories force us to confront the fact that the wilderness is not a static playground. It is a space where we are constantly being measured, analyzed, and occasionally marked as prey. The true horror lies in the uncertainty, in the lingering question of what might have happened had these individuals not heeded those primal warnings or caught that final fleeting glimpse of their stalker. Ultimately, these cases leave us with a lingering, unsettling question. How often have we been watched, only to walk away unharmed, simply because the observer chose to let us go? We are never as separate from the natural order as we pretend to be. The next time you find yourself alone, surrounded by the deceptive silence of the woods or the darkness of an empty road, remember that you are not just an observer. You are part of an ancient, unforgiving cycle. Listen to your gut, respect the silence, and never mistake a lack of visibility for a lack of presence. In the grand design of the wild, the hunter rarely makes their presence known until it is far too late to run. Stay vigilant, because the darkness is always listening, and it never truly sleeps. There is a strange part of human nature that makes us want to go exactly where we are told not to go. When we see a high fence, a locked gate, or a warning sign that says keep out, something inside of us gets incredibly curious. We start to wonder, what is on the other side? Is it a beautiful view, a hidden secret, or something dangerous? For most of us, we look at the warning signs, we feel that little spark of curiosity, and then we turn around and walk away. We follow the rules because we know those rules are usually there to keep us safe. But some people cannot resist the temptation. They see the boundary as a challenge. They decide to step over the line, to push past the warnings, and to explore the forbidden zones. Today, we are going to look at 3 stories of people who did exactly that. They went into places that were completely off limits, and they ended up facing consequences that were far more terrifying than any warning sign could ever describe. Our first story takes us to the beautiful island of Oahu in Hawaii. It was February 27th, 2015. An 18-year-old native Hawaiian named Ballen was visiting his grandmother. Ballen was an energetic young man who loved the outdoors. Even though he was native to Hawaii, he had not spent a lot of time on Oahu, so this trip was a special occasion. He wanted to make the most of his time there, and there was one specific adventure that he had been dreaming about for years. He wanted to climb the famous haiku stairs, which are also known to locals as the Stairway to Heaven. Now, the Stairway to Heaven is not your typical hiking trail. It is a highly dangerous, extremely narrow, and completely illegal pathway that climbs up the side of a massive mountain. The trail consists of nearly 4,000 steel steps that are bolted directly into the steep cliffs. It was originally built during World War II by the United States Navy so they could gain access to the top of this mountain where they had a secret radio station. After the war was over, instead of demolishing the steps, they allowed people to walk up and check out the view. But it was so dangerous and poorly maintained that they eventually closed it to the public starting in 1987. They literally put up a fence and put guards out to keep people from going in, and they handed out massive fines to anyone caught trespassing, but Ballen really wanted to do this. That morning, he told his grandmother that he was thinking about hopping the fence and making the hike. His grandmother immediately got worried. She told him that it was a horrible idea, explaining how dangerous the crumbling stairs were and warning him that he would be fined thousands of dollars if he got caught. Ballen backed down and told her that he would not go, playing it off like he had changed his mind. But sure enough, right after breakfast, he slipped out of the house, hopped on a bus, and made his way over to the base of these stairs. Even though it was totally illegal, he was so excited about the hike that he documented the whole trip by posting pictures of it to his social media. The first photo he posted showed him standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the massive mountain towering above him. He added a caption about how excited he was to finally start the hike. Over the next few hours, Ballen climbed higher and higher into the clouds. He kept taking photos and posting them online for his friends and family to see. Each picture showed the stunning, dramatic drops on either side of the narrow metal stairs. He looked happy, full of energy, and completely fine. And then he kept climbing, taking more pictures as the stairs became steeper and more treacherous. But then, right around 11 o'clock that morning, the posting stopped abruptly. He had not reached the summit yet. You figure if you are going to do this hike and you are already posting pictures of the way up, certainly when you get to the summit, you are going to take a whole bunch of pictures and post those because that is the prize at the end. But for whatever reason, the posting stopped at 11 and he clearly had not reached the summit yet. By that night, when he did not come home, his family was really concerned and they notified the police. The police launched a huge search for him, looking all over the stairs. They had helicopters out, and even the Navy got involved, but there was absolutely no sign of him. He had just vanished. When they could not find him after several days, they had to call the search off. The assumption was that he simply slipped at some point and fell down the mountain, which is exactly why the stairs are off limits and not safe. But when people reviewed some of his last photos that he had posted to social media, they noticed something chilling. One shot looked like he was just taking a picture of the dense forest around the stairs. But if you look more closely, there is a man very clearly crouched down in the bushes a little ways down the trail who appears to be hiding. Many people believe that this man was following Ballen and at some point attacked him. They believe Ballen did not fall off the mountain, but was instead abducted or killed. To this day, Ballen has never been found, and that mystery man has never been identified. Now, let us travel to the most remote island in the world, which is Bouvet Island. It is an uninhabited 19 square mile chunk of rock and ice situated in the South Atlantic. If you were looking on a map and drew a 1,000-mile radius around Bouvet Island, there would be absolutely nothing else inside of it. There is no land, there is nothing. In fact, the nearest land is 1,100 miles away, and that is Antarctica, which is not permanently inhabited. The nearest permanently inhabited land is South Africa, and that is 1,600 miles away. The island is so far away from anything that in 1979, Israel and South Africa dropped 2 nuclear bombs near it, and nobody noticed. The only reason anyone found out is because a United States satellite happened to be looking in its direction and saw 2 bright flashes of light. For the very few people who have ever gone to Bouvet Island, you cannot just take a ship there because all around the edges of this island are these jagged ice cliffs and the water is treacherous. If you were to fall in, you would get sucked up underneath the rocks and you would be done for. So, nearly anyone who has stepped foot on Bouvet Island has taken a helicopter, which is a long, sketchy flight. Anyone who has been on the island only stays for a few minutes because they are worried about a storm rolling in, and the weather there is famously bad. Oh, and Bouvet Island is also an active volcano. It is a horrible place where nobody should go, but a few people still do. In 1964, British explorer Alan Crawford was sent out to Bouvet Island with a team of scientists to inspect the northwest corner of the island where a recent lava flow had created a flat shelf. The British wanted to build a weather station there, but they needed someone to go out and give the green light. On April 2nd, 1964, Crawford and his crew departed South Africa and began the long helicopter ride. When they finally touched down, everybody was on edge because they were in the most remote place in the world. The team immediately got to work surveying the site, while Crawford decided to step over the ridge for just a couple of minutes to look out at the island. He was fascinated with Bouvet Island and wanted to get a better look at it. He walked up this embankment and crested the hill, and as he looked down, he saw a little rocky alcove where there was a bit of a beach. And sitting in the shallow waters of this lagoon, he saw a wooden lifeboat that was half sunken. He could not believe it because he knew it was not theirs, and he was thinking how a boat could have gotten here at all when the nearest land was 1,100 miles away. He started walking down towards the beach and saw 2 wooden oars that went with the boat. Next to them was a flattened copper tank used to catch water, and next to that was a wooden barrel which would have been used to store water. He looked around for other signs of human life, but there were none. There was no tent, no clothes, and no human remains. He got down to the beach and waded into the water to inspect the lifeboat. He looked for identifying marks or numbers, but there were none. Because Crawford knew they had very little time, he ran back on shore, took a quick photo of the lifeboat with his camera, and then returned to his team. He told them what he had found, but his team was so focused on getting the survey done and getting out of there that they did not really care. They said it probably just washed up from some shipwreck and told him to forget about it. Crawford flew back to South Africa, showed the photo to his superiors, but they did not care either. 2 years later, another crew was sent to survey that same lagoon, but when they arrived, there was no boat, no barrel, no copper tank, and no oars. It was as if it was never there. We still do not know who was on that boat, how they got there or where they went. In central Texas lies a stunning natural wonder called Jacob's Well. It is this beautiful, crystal clear water spring that people love to visit every summer when the weather gets hot in Texas. People converge on Jacob's Well to enjoy swimming in the refreshing water, but it is not just for casual swimmers trying to avoid the heat. It is also for daredevils who strap scuba gear on and dive down through a 10-foot wide shaft that leads to one of the most intricate and dangerous underwater cave systems in the world. Jacob's Well is broken up into 4 distinct chambers, and as you move from one chamber to the next, it gets harder and harder to squeeze through the narrow spaces. Each of the chambers gets smaller and darker because you are losing sunlight, making them overall much more difficult to navigate. If you put on your scuba gear and hop into Jacob's Well, you swim straight down and reach the first chamber, which sits between 30 and 55 feet deep. In this first chamber, the sunlight still hits, so there is algae and wildlife, and this is where rookie scuba divers spend their time. At the bottom of the first chamber is another shaft opening, but it is much narrower, and this tunnel actually makes up the second chamber, bringing you down to 80 feet deep. Any diver in the second chamber has to be extremely aware of their surroundings on their ascent so they do not go down the false chimney. The false chimney is an opening that looks exactly like the main exit out of the second chamber, but it is a complete dead end. It loops around before hitting a solid rock wall, forcing you to go all the way back out, assuming you have enough air. The second chamber attracts intermediate divers, but it is very tight and claustrophobic. If you continue down past the 80-foot mark, there is a very tight squeeze that you can barely get through with your air tanks on. This brings you into a small room that is the third chamber. At this point, the sunlight is gone, and there is loose silt and gravel on the floor. If your fin so much as knocks it, the silt will float into the water and completely blind you. Generally speaking, only expert divers ever go into this third chamber. At the bottom of this chamber is a heavy metal grate that sits over a tiny little opening, which is the entrance to the infamous fourth and final chamber of Jacob's Well. No one can describe what it actually looks like inside the fourth chamber, because once you go in, it is impossible not to kick up a ton of silt, meaning you are going in blind. Furthermore, anyone who has successfully entered the fourth chamber has died there. There are literally deceased divers inside of the fourth chamber, and after about a dozen people died trying to get in there, they finally sealed it up with that heavy grate. But to go in, you have to remove your air tanks, push them ahead of you through the hole, and then slowly wriggle your way in while keeping the mouthpiece in your mouth. In 1983, 2 24-year-old college students named Richard Patton and Clark McConnell entered Jacob's Well around 8:30 in the evening. They were both highly experienced advanced scuba divers who had dived Jacob's Well before, and they wanted to check out the fourth chamber. They got in the water, went through the first chamber, continued into the second chamber, wriggled into the third chamber, and reached the grate. Using some equipment they brought with them, they were able to pry open the heavy grate. Richard Patton was the first one to go in. He removed his tanks, pushed them inside the opening, and began headfirst to slither inside the fourth chamber. Clark waited outside in the third chamber. But as soon as Richard made it inside, things went terribly wrong. Clark would later state that as soon as Richard got into the chamber, he came screaming back out of the opening. Clark realized that Richard did not have his mouthpiece in and did not have his scuba tanks on. He had dropped his gear in the pitch blackness and was desperately trying to wriggle his way out on a breath hold. Richard was reaching for Clark to pull him through the hole. As soon as Richard got free, Clark took his own mouthpiece off and jammed it into Richard's mouth. They began buddy breathing, sharing the single regulator back and forth as they made their way back up, leaving the lost equipment behind. They made it back into the third chamber and then into the second chamber, kicking desperately to reach the surface. But in their panic, their heads suddenly hit solid rock, and they realized they had gone up the false chimney. What was even worse was that they heard the empty hiss of their tank, meaning they were completely out of air. Clark, who had taken a full breath before the air ran out, turned and managed to swim out of the false chimney and make it to the surface before drowning. But Richard was not as lucky. His final moments were spent in total darkness, with the silt kicked up all around him with no air and no idea where to go. He desperately tried to swim up, but kept hitting the wall of the false chimney before ultimately drowning. When recovery divers went down to retrieve his body, they found him jammed up at the very end of the false chimney. When we look back at these three cases, we are left with a profound sense of mystery and a deep appreciation for the boundaries that exist in our world. It is easy to look at warning signs, fences, and closed gates as mere inconveniences designed to restrict our freedom, but the reality is much more sobering. These boundaries are often written in the history of tragic lessons learned by those who came before us. The lure of the forbidden is a powerful force in human psychology, drawing us toward the edges of the map and the depths of the unknown, but nature is completely indifferent to our curiosity. In the case of Ballen, an ordinary trip to visit his grandmother turned into a parent's worst nightmare, leaving a family with a permanent void and a haunting question that may never be answered. Was Ballen simply a victim of the treacherous, crumbling steps of the Haiku stairs, or did he cross paths with a predator who was using the illegal trail as a hunting ground? The image of the crouched figure in the bushes remains a chilling reminder that when we step off the beaten path, we leave behind the safety of society and enter a world where we are completely vulnerable. On Bouvet Island, the mystery of the abandoned lifeboat challenges our understanding of human survival. Who were the people who rowed a simple wooden boat across thousands of miles of the most hostile ocean on Earth only to land on a freezing volcanic rock? How did they manage to survive, and where did they go when the boat vanished? The complete lack of human remains or personal belongings on that icy beach suggests a story of quiet desperation, a struggle against the elements that was ultimately swallowed by the freezing wind and snow, leaving behind only a single photograph as proof that they were ever there. And at Jacob's Well, the tragic fate of Richard Patton shows us how quickly an exciting adventure can turn into a deadly trap. The false chimney stands as a physical manifestation of our worst fears, an illusion that promises safety but delivers only darkness and confinement. For the survivors, the guilt and the memories of those final desperate moments under the water are a heavy burden to carry, a constant reminder of how a single wrong turn in the dark can make the difference between life and death. Ultimately, these stories remind us to respect the limits of our own endurance and the rules that protect us, because once we step across that line into the forbidden, we are entirely on our own, and the earth does not always let us return. It makes you realize that sometimes the signs are there for a reason, and some secrets are simply meant to stay buried in the quiet, dark places where humans were never meant to go. And the scariest part is every single one of these people thought they would make it back. If you're not ready to sleep yet, there are more true mysteries waiting in the next video. If you Google the most incredible story of all time, this story pops up all over the internet. When you read through it, you will completely understand why. Let us go straight to Muskegon, Michigan in the early 1940s. A young man named Joseph Byerly was living a normal, ordinary life. He was a great athlete and a senior at his high school. He was so talented that he actually earned a full scholarship to attend Notre Dame University. He had a bright future, and his parents were very proud. But then, in December of 1941, everything changed. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and the United States entered World War II. When Joseph graduated in 1942, he had a massive decision to make. He had this amazing college opportunity, but he just could not bring himself to go. He saw all the other young men his age going off to fight, and he realized he could not sit in a safe classroom while others were risking their lives. So, he turned down his scholarship and enlisted in the Army. He immediately volunteered for one of the most dangerous units in the entire Army, the parachute infantry. To become a paratrooper, Joseph had to survive a training regimen that was absolute hell. The instructors pushed these young men to their absolute physical limits every single day. Joseph spent hours doing physical training in blistering, humid heat that made it hard to breathe. They went on exhausting forced marches that lasted for miles and miles, carrying heavy backpacks. They had to run up steep mountains carrying their full combat gear, with their heavy boots pounding against the dirt until their lungs burned and their legs felt like lead. By 1943, Joseph was fully trained and stationed in England, desperate to put his training to the test. But the massive Allied invasion of occupied France was still several months away. Joseph did not want to wait around in a barracks doing nothing. So, when the military started looking for volunteers for an incredibly dangerous and highly classified mission, he stepped forward immediately. This mission was run by the OSS, which was the predecessor to the modern CIA. The OSS officers sat the volunteers down and explained that they would be parachuting in the middle of the night, completely alone, into Nazi-occupied France. Each volunteer would carry a heavy backpack loaded with solid gold bars. Once they hit the ground, they had to find the French resistance and hand the gold over so they could fund their operations. The resistance would try their best to protect them and smuggle them back to England, but there were absolutely no guarantees. The OSS officers made it very clear that if they were caught, they would be brutally tortured and executed as spies. But Joseph did not hesitate. He boarded the plane in the dark, jumped out into the night, and successfully completed the mission. He managed to deliver the gold and get back to England safely. He liked the rush of the mission so much that when they asked for volunteers again shortly after, he signed up and completed a second successful jump. Shortly after his second mission, word came down that the D-Day invasion was set to take place on June 6th. Joseph's unit was told they would be parachuting into France the night before to destroy bridges, cut power supply lines, and soften up the defenses before the main invasion force hit Utah Beach just a couple of hours later. So, in the dead of night on June 5th, Joseph and his unit were flying over France when their transport plane was suddenly struck by heavy enemy fire. As their plane was literally falling to the ground in flames, Joseph leaped out of the door into the dark sky. But the problem was, he was only 400 feet off the ground, which is extremely low for a jump. His parachute inflated just in time, and he managed to survive the fall, but he landed right on top of a stone church where a German sniper was positioned in the steeple. The sniper spotted him on the roof and began taking shots, forcing Joseph to dodge the bullets before slipping off the roof and running out of sight. Once on the ground, Joseph was completely alone with no idea where the rest of his unit was. He loaded his M1 carbine and began an incredible one-man mission. He ran from the church under sniper fire and eventually made it to the town's power substation, which he blew up with thermite to cut the power to the entire town. From there, he went building to building, fighting every German soldier he came across, including an entire squad of German infantry that he ambushed with hand grenades. At some point, Joseph made his way over to one of the bridges leading into this town that, if he blew up, would prevent the Germans from sending reinforcements to Utah Beach. But as he crawled through one of the thick hedgerows near the bridge, he fell headfirst into a German machine gun nest. When he turned around, there were multiple machine guns pointed right at his face. He had no choice but to raise his hands and surrender. The Germans marched Joseph to a POW holding area, but as soon as he got there, massive explosions ripped through the camp. It was not clear if it was German artillery or American aircraft, but shells were killing both guards and prisoners. A piece of shrapnel tore into Joseph's leg, blowing him into a ditch. Despite being in agonizing pain, he took this as an opportunity to escape. He got up and ran as best as he could, remaining uncaught for 12 hours before he was caught again. This time, they locked him in the back of a covered truck to send him to St. Lo. But on the way, an Allied aircraft strafed the vehicle. Joseph survived the attack and was able to leap out of a hole in the side of the truck. He attempted to escape, but was caught again. The Germans got him to St. Lo, and that night, the Americans launched an all-night bombing campaign. Joseph narrowly survived, which is a recurring theme in his story because he was repeatedly almost killed by his own teammate. For the next few days, German officers interrogated Joseph 20 to 24 hours a day. He did not give them any information, repeatedly calling them names until they got so fed up they just beat him unconscious. He was kept in a hospital for several days to recover. For the next 3 months, Joseph was starved, beaten, and moved to multiple camps, forced to do back-breaking labor all day while weathering hunger, disease, and exhaustion. At one point, he was locked inside a crowded boxcar with 50 other men. The train was strafed by Allied planes, and Joseph was one of the very few people to survive. In September of 1944, Joseph was moved to a prison camp in Poland that held 12,000 Russian prisoners. As soon as he got there, he immediately began planning his next escape. 2 months later, on a freezing night in November, Joseph, along with 3 other American prisoners, managed to cut the barbed wire, snuck out of the camp, and began making their escape south. They snuck into a nearby railway station and hopped on a train car they believed was headed deeper into Poland. Their plan was to meet up with the Soviet Red Army as it pushed through the region. But unfortunately, they got on the wrong train and they wound up in Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany. Now, one thing you do not hear much about when it comes to World War II is there was actually a large number of Germans who hated Hitler and totally disagreed with the Nazis. They had organized a secret German underground resistance designed to help the Allies during the war. So, when Joseph and the other 3 American prisoners arrived in Berlin, still wearing their prisoner uniforms, a member of the German resistance saw them and immediately grabbed them, bringing them into hiding. But after only a week, the infamous Nazi secret police, also known as the Gestapo, discovered them and arrested them. Over the next few days, Joseph and the other American prisoners got to see firsthand just how awful the Gestapo really were. They were constantly interrogated while being beaten, kicked, walked on, and strung up by their arms backwards. They were hit with whips, clubs, and rifle butts until they drifted into unconsciousness. As soon as they started to come to, the torture would start all over again. After those 10 days, the Gestapo finally turned Joseph and the other 3 American prisoners over to the German army, who put them in the brutal prison camp called Stalag Luft III. Upon arrival, Joseph was immediately sentenced to 30 days inside a 4x5-foot pine box that was too small to stand up or lay down in. Fortunately for him, he only had to endure 7 days because a Red Cross operative from Geneva intervened on his behalf. It would take months for Joseph to get his strength back after being inside of this box, but as soon as he did, he began plotting his next escape. One night, Joseph, along with his 3 American prisoner buddies, managed to break through a prison wall and made a mad dash for freedom. But the Nazi prison guards saw them and opened fire on them. All 3 of Joseph's friends were shot and killed as they ran. Joseph got away, only to hear the faint barking of the German shepherds the Nazis had sent to hunt him down. So, in the freezing cold of Poland in January, Joseph leaped headfirst into a partially frozen river and swam over 2 miles down it before getting out and running blindly into the woods. Somehow, miraculously, he managed to reach Soviet lines before he froze to death. There, he spoke with the battalion commander, Alexandra Samasenko, an incredibly brave woman who holds the distinction of being the only female tank commander in all of World War II. Even though Joseph spoke very little Russian, he convinced her to let him join her unit, and so she gave him a gun and some ammunition, and she told him what their next objective was. It turns out they were going to liberate the same prison camp he had just escaped from. And so Joseph, alongside the Soviet Red Army that he now fought for, turned around and went to smash this prison camp, After the dust had settled, Joseph raided the main camp office and stole his defiant official prisoner of war photo that the Germans had taken of him on the first day he got captured. Joseph continued to fight alongside the Soviets across the Eastern Front for a couple of months. But when a German dive bomber blew up the tank that Joseph was riding on, he was badly wounded and evacuated to a Russian field hospital. There, he received a visit from Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the most important Soviet military commander in World War II, who was intrigued by the only non-Soviet in the hospital. He sat with Joseph and learned his story through an interpreter. Afterwards, he provided Joseph with official paperwork that would allow him to safely rejoin American forces. And so, in February of 1945, Joseph was sent to the United States Embassy in Moscow. But unfortunately, when he finally met a friendly American face after nearly a year of fighting behind enemy lines, they did not believe his story. They told him that Joseph R. Byerly had been killed in action on the 10th of June, 1944, and that they had already held a funeral mass in his honor in Muskegon, and that his obituary had already been printed in the local newspaper. But despite Joseph painstakingly going through his story over and over again, the ambassador just could not believe what he was hearing. Worried that Joseph might actually be a well-trained German spy, the ambassador sent him to Odessa to have his credentials verified. But Odessa had the same problem and could not verify him, so they sent him to Egypt. Egypt had the same problem, and they too could not verify his credentials, so they sent him to Italy, where they finally used his official fingerprints and confirmed that yes, this man is in fact the real Joseph R. Byerly. And so, on the 11th of April 1945, Joseph returned home to Muskegon, Michigan, and needless to say, his parents were very surprised to see him because they were completely convinced he had died 10 months earlier. Exactly 1 year later, Joseph would actually get married to his sweetheart in the exact same church that had held his funeral mass when everyone believed he was dead. Joseph was given the Purple Heart, and then in the 1990s, he was given additional presidential awards from United States President Bill Clinton, as well as the Russian President Boris Yeltsin. Joseph was also given a custom-made AK-47 from the guy who actually invented the AK-47, Mikhail Kalashnikov. Joseph died in 2004 at the age of 81, and his son would go on to become the United States ambassador to Russia under both President George W. Bush and President Barack Obama, completing an incredibly historic family legacy. Joseph died in 2004 at the age of 81, leaving behind one of the most extraordinary stories of World War II. But, believe it or not, there are even more unbelievable true stories just like this one. Click the next video on your screen, and I'll see you there. Sometimes we think we have a solid grip on how the world works. We wake up, we go about our normal routines, and we assume that the rules of reality will keep everything in its proper place. We trust our senses, we trust our minds, and we trust that the environments we step into will behave in predictable ways. But every now and then, the universe decides to throw those rules completely out the window. Today, we are going to look at 3 incredible stories that demonstrate just how bizarre, unpredictable, and downright terrifying life can be when the ordinary suddenly collides with the impossible. These are stories about real people who found themselves in situations that sound like they were pulled straight from a Hollywood movie. But every single one of these events actually happened, and the details will leave you questioning how much we truly know about the world around us. From a chaotic clash of identities on the streets of Detroit, to a mysterious voice that acted as a guardian angel in London, and finally to a man who defied the laws of probability in the dark waters of the Atlantic, these stories show us that reality is often much stranger than fiction. Our first story takes us to the city of Detroit, Michigan, specifically to the east side of the city on Andover Street. If you were to ask anyone who lives in this neighborhood, they would tell you right away that Andover Street has a reputation. It is an area that has been heavily affected by drug activity for a very long time. Because of this, the local police department is constantly running operations to try and clean up the streets and keep the community safe. On a cold Thursday morning, specifically November 9th, 2017, two special operations officers from the Detroit Police Department were getting ready to start a specific type of undercover operation known as a push-off. Now, if you are not familiar with what a push-off is, it is basically a reverse sting operation. Undercover police officers will set themselves up in an area, usually in a house that is known for drug transactions, and they will pretend to be the local drug dealers. When unsuspecting customers walk up to the house trying to buy drugs, the undercover officers will invite them inside, wait for them to make a verbal request to purchase illegal substances, and then immediately arrest them and seize their vehicles. These two particular special operations officers had been working deep undercover in this specific neighborhood for quite a while. Because they had been there so long, they had a very specific local drug house that they had secured and set up for this exact operation. They arrived at the house, got themselves in character, and began to wait. Meanwhile, not too far away, another unit from a completely different police precinct was planning their own drug enforcement operation for that very same day. This second unit consisted of a group of undercover officers who were running a buy-bust operation. A buy-bust is the exact opposite of a push-off. In a buy-bust, undercover officers pretend to be drug buyers. They walk around the neighborhood, look for active drug houses, and attempt to buy illegal substances from real drug dealers. Once the transaction is initiated, they signal their backup team to swoop in and make the arrest. But the problem was that there was a massive breakdown in communication between the two different police precincts. Neither group had any idea that the other group was operating on Andover Street that morning. It was a classic bureaucratic oversight, but on the streets, it was a recipe for disaster. Around midday, two undercover officers from the 2nd Precinct were walking down Andover Street looking for active drug houses. They saw the house where the first two undercover officers were waiting. To the officers from the 2nd Precinct, this house looked exactly like a real active drug house, and to the officers inside, the two men walking up to the porch looked exactly like typical drug customers. The two undercover buyers walked up the steps and knocked on the front door. The undercover officers inside opened the door, looked them over, and in accordance with their training, invited them inside. The buyers walked in and sat down in the living room. The undercover officers, acting as dealers, asked them what they were looking for. The buyers then asked if they could purchase some drugs. As soon as those words left their mouths, the undercover officers, acting as dealers, whipped out their police badges, drew their service weapons, and ordered the two men to get on the ground. But instead of complying, the two buyers did something that absolutely shocked the dealers. They also whipped out their police badges, drew their service weapons, and yelled back that no, they were the ones who needed to get on the ground. At this point, both groups of officers were standing in a freezing, high-tension standoff. Neither side believed the other side was actually telling the truth. In the high-stakes world of undercover operations, criminals will often pose as police officers to rob rival dealers or escape arrest. So, the officers from the 1st Precinct were convinced that these two buyers were actually armed criminals using fake police badges. And the officers from the 2nd Precinct were convinced that the dealers were criminals trying to rip them off with fake badges of their own. They stood there, guns pointed at each other, in a tense standoff that looked exactly like that famous scene from The Office, where everyone is pointing a gun at everyone else, trying to figure out who the double agent is. They began periodically hurling insults and threats at each other, trying to force the other side to stand down. But nobody was backing down. The tension in the room was boiling over, and both sides were terrified that if they fired a shot, it would end in a bloodbath. But instead of pulling their triggers, when neither side stood down, they all eventually lowered their weapons. But they did not talk it out. Instead, they lunged at each other and proceeded to beat the living crap out of each other. A massive, chaotic fistfight broke out right there in the living room. Within moments, the backup officers from both precincts, who had been waiting nearby in unmarked vehicles, saw the commotion and rushed into the house. But instead of breaking up the fight, they also got confused and joined in. It turned into a massive brawl of police officers fighting other police officers, with punches flying, furniture breaking, and complete chaos taking over the house. After the dust finally settled and the haymakers had stopped, someone finally managed to get a radio transmission through, and the two groups of police suddenly realized the monumental mistake they had just made. They immediately stopped fighting and began to apologize to one another, nursing their bruises and panting for air. Luckily, none of the officers were critically injured in this bizarre mix-up. However, two officers did have to be taken to the hospital for treatment, though fortunately their injuries were very minor. One officer ended up with a massive black eye, and another had a split lip. When the news of this incident got out, Detroit's own chief of police, along with the media and the public at large, all came out and said that this entire snafu was a total embarrassment for the department. It showed a clear lack of coordination and communication. But, on the other hand, some people argued that the officers involved actually deserved a little bit of credit. After all, their job was to be undercover. And they were apparently so incredibly good at being undercover that they were able to completely fool other trained professional police officers who were looking for the exact same things. It turns out they were just too good at their jobs, but you can be the judge of that. Our next story was pulled from a 1997 article published in the prestigious British medical journal, The Show. This article was written by a psychiatrist who personally treated the patient, who will be the focal point of this story. The only reason we bring this up right at the beginning is because this story sounds so completely made up that if it were not documented in an official, peer-reviewed medical journal, it would be almost impossible to believe. One night in the cold winter of 1984, a healthy, middle-aged woman, who we will call Brenda for the sake of this story, was sitting in her quiet home in London, England. It was a completely normal, peaceful evening. Brenda was sitting on her couch, enjoying the quiet warmth of her living room and reading a book. But as she was reading, she suddenly heard a voice speak directly in her head. The voice did not sound like her own thoughts, and it did not sound like it was coming from the room around her. It was a distinct, clear, calm voice that spoke directly into her mind. The voice said, "Please do not be afraid." I know this must be shocking for you to hear me speaking to you like this, but this was the easiest way I could think of. My friend and we used to work at the Children's Hospital, and we would like to help you. Brenda sat frozen on her couch. She could not believe what was happening. She had absolutely no history of mental illness, she had never heard voices in her head before, and she was a completely rational, healthy person. The voice she was hearing was so incredibly clear, and it did not sound like any voice she had ever heard in her real life. At first, Brenda did not do anything. She just sat there on the couch holding her book, waiting and hoping that this was just some strange, fleeting trick of her mind. But the voice in her head seemed to pick up on her internal panic. The voice spoke again and said, "Brenda, this is not a hallucination. We are real, and we want to help you." Brenda did not believe the voice was real. She was absolutely convinced that she had just lost her mind and was experiencing some kind of sudden, severe mental breakdown. For the rest of the night, she did her absolute best to completely ignore the voice in her head, trying to focus on anything else. First thing the next morning, Brenda went to her doctor's office, explained what was happening, and begged them for help. The doctor was very concerned and immediately referred her to a local psychiatrist. Brenda went over to the psychiatrist's office, and they performed a thorough psychological evaluation. After talking with her, the psychiatrist admitted that they did not really know why she was suddenly hearing these voices, There was absolutely no clear medical explanation or typical trigger for why a healthy, middle-aged woman with no history of mental issues would suddenly start hearing clear, distinct voices. So Brenda was ultimately diagnosed with a rare condition called functional hallucinatory psychosis. This diagnosis basically meant that Brenda was indeed hallucinating, but there was no clear physical or psychological reason why it was happening. The psychiatrist began treating Brenda with a strong antipsychotic drug, and they also set up regular supportive counseling sessions. Over the next couple of weeks, Brenda was incredibly diligent. She took her medications exactly as prescribed, and she never missed a single appointment. And slowly but surely, the voices in her mind began to fade, and eventually they stopped completely. Brenda was overjoyed. She went back into her psychiatrist's office, looked at him, and said, "Doctor, you have saved me. The voices are completely gone, and I am so happy." The psychiatrist would later write in his medical journal that Brenda was visibly relieved during this appointment. It was completely obvious to him that she was not making any of this up. She had really believed she was hearing these voices, she had been terrified by them, and now she was profoundly grateful to have her life back to normal. After leaving the office, Brenda decided that she and her family needed to celebrate. They decided to go on a vacation outside of London just to relax and enjoy the fact that she had not, in fact, lost her mind. But while they were away on holiday enjoying the peaceful countryside, the nightmare returned. Brenda suddenly heard the voices in her head again. But this time, the tone was different. It was urgent. The voices told her that she had to get back to London as soon as possible because there was something terribly wrong with her. Along with this warning, the voices did something even more bizarre. They gave her a very specific street address in London that she was supposed to go to in order to seek immediate treatment. Brenda was absolutely horrified. She was devastated that the voices were back after she thought she was cured, but she was also incredibly scared by the specific nature of what they were saying. She began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was some terrifying truth to what these voices were telling her. What if there really was something horribly wrong with her body? Brenda ran to her husband crying and explained everything that had just happened. Her husband was a very loving and reassuring man. He held her and told her that she should just try to totally ignore the voices again. He pointed out that they had gone away before with medication, and there was probably nothing physically wrong with her. He urged her to just try to relax and enjoy the rest of their vacation. But Brenda could not relax. No matter what her husband said, she could not ignore the voices because they were constantly speaking to her now, repeating the same urgent message over and over again. They kept saying, "You need to leave, you need to go back, there is something wrong with you." Finally, unable to bear the constant mental pressure, Brenda convinced her family to end their vacation early, pack up their things, and head back to London. As soon as they arrived in the city, Brenda made her husband get in the car with her, and they drove straight to the exact street address the voices had given her. When they arrived and stepped out of the car, they found themselves standing right in front of the brain scan unit of a London hospital. Brenda and her husband stood on the pavement, completely shocked. They had never been to this building before, and Brenda had no prior knowledge of this specific medical facility or its address. But before they could even begin to process the sheer impossibility of what they were looking at, the voices in Brenda's head came back with absolute clarity. They told her that she needed to go inside the building immediately and request a brain scan for two very specific reasons. First, they said there was a tumor in her brain. Second, they said this tumor was causing her brain stem to swell. At first, Brenda went inside the brain scan facility and requested an immediate scan, honestly admitting to the reception staff that voices in her head had directed her to this exact address. Because she had no official doctor referral, the hospital had to turn her away, leaving Brenda in a state of absolute panic. She immediately called her psychiatrist, explaining how the voices had guided her to this real medical building. The psychiatrist was highly skeptical but agreed to order the scan anyway, solely to put her mind at ease. A month later, Brenda had the scan done, and the results completely shocked the entire medical community. The scan revealed she indeed had a brain tumor, and her brain stem was swollen, despite her showing absolutely no physical symptoms. After consulting her family, Brenda chose immediate surgery. As soon as she made the decision, the voices told her she had made the right choice. The surgery was a total success. In the recovery room, the voices spoke to her one last time, saying they were pleased to have helped her and said goodbye. Brenda never heard them again. To this day, the medical community still has no explanation for who or what those voices in Brenda's head really were. Our final story is about a man named Michael Packard, who might be either the luckiest or unluckiest person alive, depending on how you look at his incredible life. In 2001, when Michael was 38 years old, he survived a horrific plane crash over the jungles of Costa Rica that tragically killed the pilot, co-pilot, and another passenger on impact. Michael and 4 other survivors were left badly injured and stranded in the extremely remote wilderness for 48 agonizing hours before search and rescue teams finally reached them. Doctors later told him he would not have survived another night in the jungle. Over the next 2 decades, Michael, a commercial diver by trade, survived 2 separate great white shark encounters off California, got lost at sea for hours in the open ocean before being miraculously rescued, and even discovered a long-time missing person's body 60 feet underwater off the coast of Massachusetts. But absolutely none of these events compare to what happened to him on the morning of June 11th, 2021, when he experienced a 1 in a trillion event that baffled scientists around the world. On that peaceful summer morning, the 57-year-old Michael climbed into his boat with his longtime diving partner Josiah, heading out off the coast of Cape Cod to do some lobster diving. Around 8 in the morning, after successfully gathering about 100 pounds of lobsters, Michael decided to go down for one final dive. Josiah watched from the boat as Michael disappeared below the surface of the calm water. Suddenly, Josiah saw a massive, violent eruption of white water where Michael had just submerged, followed by a dark shadow moving rapidly below. Michael had been descending to 60 feet when, at about 45 feet, something hit him from behind like a freight train, immediately plunging him into total darkness and knocking his mouthpiece out. Fumbling around in panic, Michael felt soft, warm, quivering, muscular walls that were actively pulsating. He managed to find his regulator, took a deep breath, and realized there were no sharp teeth, meaning he was not inside a shark. He had actually been scooped up by a giant humpback whale. Humpback whales only eat very small fish, and when this whale realized it had accidentally swallowed a human and a heavy metal scuba tank, it began violently shaking its head side to side to eject him. This thrashing was what caused the dramatic eruption of water Josiah saw from the boat. After 45 agonizing seconds inside the whale's mouth, Michael was finally spat back out into the open water. He swam directly to the surface, saw the whale's tail fins swimming away, and was pulled to safety by Josiah. Miraculously, Michael suffered only minor bruising on his legs and was released from the hospital that very same afternoon. He remained incredibly casual about the encounter, telling reporters he could not wait to heal up and get back to lobster diving. These 3 stories, as different as they are, remind us of a powerful truth. We live our lives under the illusion of control, believing our minds, our identities, and our natural world are completely predictable. But whether it is undercover police officers clashing on a Detroit street, a mysterious voice pointing to a silent brain tumor in London, or a commercial diver being swallowed by a gentle giant of the deep off Cape Cod, we are always just one moment away from the completely unbelievable. These events show us that the division between reality and fiction is incredibly thin, and sometimes the strangest mysteries are the ones that actually happen. They leave us with a lingering sense of wonder and a reminder that no matter how much we plan, the universe will always find a way to surprise us. So perhaps the real question is not whether these stories are true or not, but how many similar stories exist that we will never hear about. Because the truth is, moments like these come without warning. They don't follow the rules. And when they happen, they change everything. If you've made it this far, you already know reality is unfair. See you in the next story. On the morning of Monday, the 7th of January, 1985, a 31-year-old man walked through the sliding glass doors of a large international airport. He was trying his best to look calm, to look like just another traveler, but on the inside, a storm was raging. His heart was hammering against his ribs so hard he was sure the people around him could hear it. His palms were slick with sweat, making it difficult to keep a firm grip on the handles of the heavy, tangent-colored suitcase he was pulling alongside him. Every few steps, he had to stop, wipe his hands on his pants, and readjust his grip. He was nervous because he was at a crossroads, about to do something that felt both absolutely right and horribly wrong at the same time. On one hand, this trip was the culmination of months of dreaming, of planning. It was meant to be the first day of a brand new, wonderful life. A life he had envisioned down to the smallest detail. He hadn't packed much for himself, just a few changes of clothes, some toiletries, but he did have one very important personal item tucked away in his carry-on bag. It was a small, bound book filled with photographs, pictures that showed the single most important thing in his world. And that most important thing, that person, was supposed to be waiting for him in America, but on the other hand, a wave of pure terror kept washing over him. Before he could even begin to think about that new life, he had to get through this airport. He had a monumental problem to solve, and that problem was sitting right inside of the very heavy suitcase he was struggling with. He needed to get that suitcase onto his flight, a nearly 11-hour journey to California, without a single person looking inside of it. If anyone opened it, his life wasn't just starting over, it was over. And so, standing there in the bustling terminal, surrounded by the sounds of rolling luggage and announcements over the intercom, the man took a deep, shaky breath. He tightened his grip on the suitcase, handles one more time, and started walking towards the ticketing area. His plan was simple, at least on paper. He would walk up to the counter, hand over his passport and ticket, and check his bag. Then he would get on the plane. And when he landed in California, he would walk to the baggage carousel, retrieve his luggage, and everything would be okay. The nightmare would be over, and the dream could begin. Of course, he knew this was an incredible gamble. A huge risk. If there had been any other way, he would have taken it. His first choice would have been to just carry the bag onto the plane with him, to stow it in the overhead bin where he could keep an eye on it. But that was impossible. The bag was far too big, and it was unbelievably heavy. Anyone who tried to lift it would know something was wrong. So, checking it was his only option. The only other choice was to leave it behind, and that was unthinkable. He cared too much about what was inside to ever consider that. As he got closer to the airline check-in area, the line of people snaked in front of him. With every person that moved forward, his own turn got closer, and the knot of anxiety in his stomach tightened. He was starting to feel physically ill, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He thought about turning around, about just walking out of the airport and giving up, but he couldn't. He had to see this through. By the time he finally reached the front of the line, he felt dizzy, but he forced himself to stand straight. He walked up to the counter for Lufthansa Airlines, trying to arrange his face into a pleasant, neutral expression. The employee behind the counter, a cheerful-looking man, greeted him with a smile. He took the man's passport, glanced at it, typed some information into his computer, and then handed it back. Then came the moment the man had been dreading. The employee put his hand out, gesturing towards the heavy tan suitcase. This was it. This was the moment it could all fall apart. Trying to appear as casual as he could, the man lifted the suitcase off the floor and onto the scale next to the counter. For a split second, he panicked. The sheer effort it took, the way his muscles strained, it had to be obvious. He was sure the employee would look at the weight on the scale, look at him, and immediately demand he open the bag. If that happened, he knew he was finished. He would be arrested on the spot. But the employee didn't seem to notice. Or if he did, he didn't care. He just grunted a little as he slid the heavy suitcase off the scale and over to the conveyor belt behind the counter. The nervous man watched, his eyes glued to the bag as the employee heaved it onto the moving belt. He kept his gaze locked on that suitcase as it rolled away from him, getting smaller and smaller until it finally disappeared through a pair of black rubber flaps at the far end of the belt. He was so focused on the bag, so lost in that moment of intense relief, that he almost didn't hear the airline employee trying to get his attention. The employee was holding his boarding pass, waving it slightly in the air. The man snapped out of his trance, took the boarding pass, and managed to mumble a thank you. Then he turned, without a second glance back, and hurried away to find his gate and catch his flight. About 12 hours later, on the other side of the world, an employee for that same airline, Lufthansa, was making his rounds in the baggage claim area at Los Angeles International Airport, better known as LAX. It was around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Los Angeles time. The employee's job was pretty straightforward. He worked in the international terminal, and he had to monitor the big circular carousels where passengers from arriving flights picked up their luggage. He was there to make sure no bags were left behind. As he walked his usual route, his eyes scanned the carousels. Most were empty, waiting for the next flight to come in. But on one of them, he saw a single piece of luggage, a tangent-colored suitcase with soft sides just sitting there all by itself. The carousel had stopped moving. He stopped and looked up at the monitor above it to check which flight it had been for. The screen showed that the last plane to use this carousel had arrived quite a while ago. All the passengers had clearly come through, grabbed their bags, and gone on their way. All except for the owner of this one lone suitcase. The employee figured the bag must be unclaimed. This wasn't a big deal to him. It happened all the time for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes bags got sent to the wrong airport by mistake. Sometimes a passenger missed a connecting flight. Sometimes people were just forgetful and walked right out of the airport without their luggage. Whatever the reason, his job was to start the process of identifying the owner and getting the bag to them. So, like he had done countless times before, he walked over to the carousel. He reached down, grabbed the suitcase by its handle, and prepared to lift it off. But as he pulled up, a surprised grunt escaped his lips, and he stumbled backward a step. The suitcase was so much heavier than he could have possibly imagined. It felt like it was filled with rocks. He readjusted his grip, this time using both hands, bent his knees, and gave it a solid yank. The suitcase toppled off the carousel and landed on the floor with a heavy thud. It was around this time that the employee noticed something else that was strange. The suitcase had no tags on it at all. No airline tag with a destination, no personal luggage tag with a name and address. Nothing. Now, this was unusual. An unclaimed bag was one thing, but an unclaimed bag that was incredibly heavy and had no identification whatsoever, that was not normal. He knelt down on the floor next to the suitcase. He was legally allowed to open it. Unclaimed bags at airports are subject to search to identify the owner or check the contents. He found the zipper and began to pull it open. But he had only unzipped it a few inches before he froze. His eyes went wide. For a second, he just stared, unblinking, at what he could see inside the suitcase, unable to process it. Then, a jolt of adrenaline shot through him. He scrambled to his feet, leaving the bag half open on the floor, and ran to find the nearest phone to call the police. A little less than 2 hours later, at about 3:45 in the afternoon, Detective Don Ravens of the Los Angeles Police Department's Pacific Division stood in that same baggage area at LAX. He was looking down grimly into the open tan suitcase. He was surrounded by other officials from the LAPD as well as agents from the FBI. They had all been called to the airport because of what that Lufthansa employee had found. Inside the suitcase was the dead body of a young woman. Detective Ravens was taken aback. He'd seen a lot in his career, but this was something else. He guessed the woman was young, probably not even 30 years old. Looking at her features, her dark hair, he thought she might be from an Asian or a Latin American country, but that was just a guess. It was as far as he could get, since she had no identification on her and there were no tags on the bag. There were also no obvious wounds on her body, no signs of a stabbing or a gunshot. He couldn't immediately tell how she had died. Ravens spent the next hour or so speaking to airline and airport employees. He also spoke with agents from Customs, the government agency in charge of inspecting bags coming into the country. One of the biggest questions on his mind was how a suitcase with a body inside it had managed to clear customs without being detected. But a customs agent explained that they didn't actually open every single suitcase that came through. They used X-ray machines and sometimes dogs, but physical searches were random or based on suspicion. This meant that whoever had checked this bag had taken a colossal risk. At any point, the bag could have been flagged for a search, and the body would have been discovered instantly. This suggested a level of desperation, maybe even recklessness, on the part of the person who did this, but it seemed their risk had paid off, at least initially. The bag had made it all the way to California. Despite that, Ravens didn't have much to go on. His victim was a Jane Doe, with no name and no past. He knew she could be from anywhere in the world, despite his initial hunch. And because LAX was a major international hub, the person who put her in that suitcase could now also be anywhere in the world. They could have gotten on another flight and disappeared. Once Detective Ravens and the other investigators finished their preliminary examination of the scene, they didn't remove the body from the suitcase. They had the entire suitcase, with the body still inside, carefully transported to the coroner's office. Ravens hoped that an autopsy would turn up some kind of evidence, anything that could tell them who this poor woman was and what had happened to her. The next day, Tuesday, Ravens sat at his desk and opened the manila folder that had been delivered from the coroner's office. Inside was the autopsy report for his Jane Doe. As he began to read it, a sick feeling washed over him. The cold, clinical language of the report described a horrible, torturous death. The coroner had found bruises all over the woman's body. The report specified that they were the kind of deep contusions you would get from repeated, heavy blows delivered over a period of at least several hours while she was still alive. It looked like she had been brutally beaten, and her eventual cause of death was listed as suffocation. This meant one of two things. Either she was suffocated first and then put into the suitcase, or she had been put in the suitcase alive and had suffocated inside of it, trapped. Ravens put the report down and leaned back in his chair, trying to process what he had just learned. The autopsy confirmed that this young woman had died a brutal, awful death. But it hadn't brought him any closer to finding her identity. The coroner had found no identifying marks, no surgical scars, no tattoos, nothing that could help give her a name. And they found nothing on her that pointed to who might have done this to her. So, he was left with very little. He knew a woman had suffered terribly, but that was it. In the 24 hours since the body was found, Ravens had been working tirelessly. He and his team had pored over hours and hours of surveillance footage from the airport's security cameras. They were looking for anyone who looked suspicious, anyone who might have been seen in the baggage claim area and then left without any luggage. But nothing jumped out at them. He had also personally interviewed a number of airport employees who were working in the international terminal on the day the body was found. But none of them had noticed anything strange, anything out of the ordinary. And so, even though it had only been a day since the discovery, Ravens was already starting to worry that this case was going to go cold very quickly. But what Ravens hadn't counted on was the massive amount of public interest his Jane Doe case would generate. As soon as the story broke, the local TV news stations and the newspapers were all over it. The body in the suitcase story was shocking, and it captured the public's imagination. By Wednesday, just 48 hours after the body was found, the reporting had spread far beyond Los Angeles. The story made its way to Peru, where a man named Juan Espinosa saw a news report and immediately contacted the local authorities. He told them he believed the body found in Los Angeles might belong to his wife. The officials in Peru contacted the LAPD, and Juan's report eventually landed on Detective Raven's desk. Ravens opened the file and began to read. According to Juan, he and his wife lived in Lima, the capital of Peru. His wife had been desperate to leave the country to escape the crushing poverty they faced. Her dream was to get to the United States, find a job, and send money back home to her family. She had left their home with the intention of trying to sneak across the border into the U.S. She had promised Juan that as soon as she arrived safely, she would contact him. But after she left, he never heard a single word from her. This felt like a very promising lead to Ravens. It seemed to check a lot of the boxes. His Jane Doe had features that could suggest she was from a South American country like Peru. It made sense. Ravens started to build a theory. Maybe Juan's wife had paid a human smuggler, someone who transports immigrants across borders illegally for a fee. He knew that the world of human smuggling was a dangerous, unregulated business. The smugglers could be violent and reckless, and the people they were transporting were incredibly vulnerable. They had no legal protection. Sometimes, these smugglers would simply rob their clients. In worse cases, they would rob them and then kill them to get rid of any witnesses. And because the victims were undocumented and their families often didn't know the details of their travel plans, these terrible crimes often went unreported and unnoticed. If that's what had happened to his Jane Doe, it would explain a lot. It would explain the signs of a brutal beating from the autopsy. It would also explain why the tags were ripped off the suitcase. A smuggler who had just committed a murder would want to remove any form of identification from the body or the luggage that could possibly be traced back to them. Feeling a renewed sense of purpose, Ravens picked up his phone and called the LAX airport operations manager. He asked for the logs of any and all flights that had come from Peru to LAX on the day the body was found. But when he got the information back, he discovered a huge problem with his theory. There were no flights from Peru that day. Not a single one. He checked again. The only international flights that had used the specific luggage carousel where the body was found were from 3 cities: Seoul, Korea, Tokyo, Japan, and Frankfurt, Germany. He even checked to see if there were any flights that had originated in Peru and had a layover in one of those 3 countries. There were none. This meant it was simply impossible that his Jane Doe was Juan's wife. And just like that, his most promising lead evaporated. Now Ravens was stumped all over again. He had almost no physical evidence to work with. All he really had was the suitcase itself and the body inside it. And the actual crime scene, the place where this woman was killed, was most likely in Korea, Japan, or Germany. He was an LAPD detective. His jurisdiction was Los Angeles. He didn't know where he should even begin to look for more evidence. He felt like he was back at square one. But then, as he sat at his desk staring at the case file, he got an idea. Detective Ravens stood up and walked down the hall to the department's evidence room. He put on a pair of disposable latex gloves. He found the cardboard box that contained the evidence from the Jane Doe case and opened it up. There wasn't much inside. Just a few sealed plastic bags containing the jewelry and the clothing that had been found on the woman's body. All of it had already been examined by the forensics team for trace evidence like blood, hair, or fibers. But Ravens wasn't looking for blood or hair. One by one, he carefully lifted out each of the sealed bags. He looked at a small ring, a simple necklace. Then he got to her clothes. He pulled out the bag containing a blue sweater. He took the sweater out of the plastic and turned it over in his hands. He looked inside the neckband at the small white tag sewn into the fabric. And there he found exactly what he had been hoping for. A jolt of adrenaline shot through him. He felt he was onto something. He quickly reached back into the box and grabbed another plastic bag, this one with a pair of gray pants inside. He did the same thing, looking at the tag on the waistband. Then he opened a third bag with her blouse and checked the label inside that. Each time, his hunch was proven right. All of Jane Doe's clothing had labels sewn into them, and the writing on the labels was clearly in a language that was not English. Ravens wasn't a linguistics expert, but to him, the script, the shape of the letters, looked like it might be Middle Eastern. It didn't take long for the FBI to help Ravens and the LAPD identify the origin of the writing on the clothing. The labels were in Farsi. All of the clothes had been made in the Middle East, specifically in Iran. This was a huge breakthrough. Finally, Detective Ravens had a likely country of origin for his Jane Doe. She was almost certainly Iranian. But with this new information came another problem. It was really the same problem he'd had when he thought the victim was from Peru. There were only 3 international flights that his Jane Doe could have been on, the ones from Korea, Japan, and Germany. None of them had originated in Iran. And he double-checked the records. There were no connecting flights from Iran to any of those 3 cities that would have lined up with the arrival time at LAX that day. Ravens felt like he was going in circles. He decided he needed the public's help again. On Thursday, 3 days after the body was found, he and another detective sat down for an interview with a reporter from the city's biggest newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, a publication that had a wide circulation both nationally and internationally. The detective's goal was simple: to give the reporter as many updates as they could about the case, hoping that someone, somewhere in the world, would read the story, recognize a detail, and come forward with information. However, the interview didn't really play out that way. The reporter asked a lot of questions, and for most of them, Ravens and his partner had no answers. By the end of it, Ravens was feeling pretty discouraged. The last thing he said to the reporter, a quote that ended up being printed as the final line of the article, summed up his frustration perfectly. He said, "Don't be too surprised if you never find out where she came from or who she is." The next morning, Detective Ravens got to his office early. He had barely taken off his coat when his desk phone rang. He picked it up. A police officer from Sacramento, California, was on the other end of the line, and he sounded extremely worked up. He told Ravens that he knew the LAPD investigators were struggling with the airport Jane Doe case, but he said he had an unbelievable development up in Northern California that he was certain was connected. He told Ravens that authorities there had just found another body. When Ravens heard this, his first reaction wasn't excitement. It was confusion. He didn't need another body. He had a body. What he needed was a name for his Jane Doe. So he asked the Sacramento officer what he meant. Had they found another woman in another suitcase? But the officer said no. The body they found belonged to a man. And this man's name had never been on any police radar. He had died from a gunshot wound 400 miles away from where Raven's Jane Doe was found. But, the officer insisted, the story they had uncovered behind this new body would almost certainly solve the Jane Doe case in Los Angeles. This is the story that the Sacramento officer told Detective Ravens over the phone. On the evening of Monday, January 7th, just a few hours after Jane Doe's body had been discovered at LAX, a man named Hadi had driven to the Sacramento airport. He was there to pick up his friend and roommate, a 31-year-old man named Mahmoud Ayazi. Hadi was excited to see Mahmoud, who had been away on a trip for a few weeks. They were good friends, and Hadi always enjoyed being around Mahmoud. He was normally a very optimistic, fun-loving person. But on this day, when Mahmoud got into Hadi's car, Hadi immediately knew something was wrong. His friend seemed withdrawn and quiet. He was clearly very upset about something. Hadi asked him what was wrong, if his trip had gone okay. But Mahmoud just shook his head and said he was just sick with the flu. But to Hadi, Mahmoud didn't look sick. He looked worried. He looked jittery and nervous. And as they started to drive away from the airport, Mahmoud kept looking out the windows, checking the rearview mirror, like he was afraid that someone was following them. When they got back to their apartment, Mahmoud went straight to his room and went to bed. And for the next 2 days, his behavior only got stranger and more paranoid. He asked Hadi to disconnect the phone in their apartment. He said he didn't want to see any of their mutual friends. He spent most of his time just looking out the windows of their apartment as if he was watching for someone. But whenever Hadi tried to ask him what was going on, what he was so worried about, Mahmoud refused to explain. Then, sometime before 6 o'clock on Thursday morning, 3 days after Hadi had picked him up from the airport, Hadi was woken up by a sound. He heard the front door of their apartment open and then click shut. It was way too early for either of them to be up and about. And they lived in a part of the city where break-ins weren't uncommon. So the sound of the door was enough to make Hadi get out of bed and go check things out. But when he got to the living room, he didn't find an intruder. He found Mahmoud, fully dressed, in the process of leaving the apartment. Hadi asked his friend where he was going so early. But Mahmoud just shook his head and said he was just going out for a bit. There was nothing Hadi could do to stop him, so he just watched his friend walk out the door. And then Hadi went back to bed. But as he lay there, he had this sick feeling in his stomach, a feeling that something terrible was about to happen. About 2 hours later, the Sacramento Police Department received a call. Someone had found a dead body in the driver's seat of a car in a nearby parking lot. When officers arrived, they found the body of a man who had clearly died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. And on the passenger seat, next to the body, they found 2 Iranian passports and 1 boarding pass for a Lufthansa Airlines flight. Instead of everyone. When the Sacramento police officer finished telling Detective Ravens this story, he said that he believed one of the 2 passports they found in that car belonged to Ravens' Jane Doe. He said he would send it down to Los Angeles that afternoon by courier so Ravens could make a positive identification. And when the passport arrived, Ravens opened the package with trembling hands. He looked at the photograph inside. And there she was. He was finally able to give his Jane Doe her name back. She was a 20-year-old Iranian woman named Katan Safawi. And after investigators searched Mahmoud Ayazi's apartment in Sacramento, they would find one more piece of evidence that would finally explain the whole tragic story of how Katan Safawi had ended up dead inside an abandoned tan suitcase at LAX. That piece of evidence was a small, bound book, and it was full of photographs. Back on the 7th of January, 1985, a deeply nervous Mahmoud Ayazi dropped off the tan suitcase at the international airport in Frankfurt, Germany. It was one of the 3 cities that had flights arriving at LAX that day that used the specific carousel where the body was found. Inside that suitcase was Katan. Mahmoud then boarded his Lufthansa flight to Los Angeles. His trip hadn't started in Frankfurt, though. It had started weeks earlier in his home country of Iran. He had traveled there for the happiest of reasons. His travel plans had gotten complicated on the way back, and he'd gotten stuck in Germany for several days, which only added to his stress. And now, he was on the final leg of his journey home, and he was more nervous than he had ever been in his life because of what he was carrying in his checked luggage. He had thought that once he successfully checked the suitcase and got on the plane, he would feel some relief. But as his flight took off from Frankfurt, his anxiety only grew worse. The flight was nearly 11 hours long. And for every single one of those hours, he sat in his seat, his mind racing. Every time the plane hit even the slightest bit of turbulence, he imagined the worst. He pictured the suitcases in the cargo hold shifting and crashing into each other. He wanted to scream. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, the flight landed at LAX. As soon as the plane taxied to the gate, Mahmoud was on his feet. He got off the plane as fast as he could and practically ran to the baggage claim area. He needed to get his suitcase and then get on his connecting flight to Sacramento. He stood by the carousel, his heart pounding, waiting for that tan suitcase to appear. When it finally did, he snatched it off the belt. But as soon as he lifted it, he felt a cold dread wash over him. Something felt wrong. With a shaking hand, he moved to a more secluded corner of the baggage claim area, laid the suitcase down, and unzipped it. And when he looked inside, a wave of grief and horror so powerful hit him that he almost collapsed right there on the floor. The trip that Mahmoud had been dreaming of for months, the journey he was now returning from, was a trip to his home country of Iran to marry the woman he loved, Katan. And now, lying still and lifeless inside that suitcase, was the dead body of his new wife. Mahmoud had been trying to smuggle her into America so they could start their new life together. After their wedding in Iran, they had traveled to Frankfurt. But when they got there, Katan had run into problems with her visa. German officials would not let her board the plane to the United States. Mahmoud and Katan spent days trying to fix the problem, pleading with officials, but it became clear that only Mahmoud, who had the proper paperwork, would be allowed to enter the U.S. Katan would have to stay behind. They were devastated. And in their desperation, they came up with a reckless plan. Katan willingly got inside that suitcase. Mahmoud hadn't murdered her, at least not intentionally. She hadn't been trafficked or kidnapped. She chose to get in that suitcase. Together, they decided that he would smuggle her in the cargo hold of the plane. That's how they would get her to the United States and be together. When he had checked the bag in Frankfurt, she had been alive. But during the long flight, in the dark, unpressurized, and unheated cargo hold, other heavy pieces of luggage must have shifted and fallen, piling on top of her suitcase. The repeated impacts and the immense weight had slowly crushed her to death. The bruises the coroner found were not from a beating at the hands of a person, but from the brutal, indifferent force of other luggage crashing against her body inside that suitcase. And so when Mahmoud got to LAX and opened the suitcase and saw what had happened, he fell apart. He panicked. In a fog of shock and grief, he tore the identification and tags off the suitcase. He zipped it back up, pushed it back onto the carousel, and just walked away. He abandoned the body of his wife and simply got on his next flight to Sacramento. And once he landed there, the full weight of what had happened, the guilt and the grief, consumed him. For 3 days, he lived in a paranoid haze, unable to tell his friend what had happened, unable to face the reality of his loss and the role he had played in it. And 3 days later, he took his own life. When the police in Sacramento searched Mahmoud's room, they found the little bound book full of photographs that he had so carefully packed for his trip. The photos were of his and Katan's wedding. Pictures of 2 young people, smiling and full of hope, on what should have been the beginning of their new life together. The following week, the bodies of both Mahmoud and Katan were sent back to Iran. They traveled the same route they had taken to get to Los Angeles, a long journey from California through Germany and back to their home. But this time, they traveled together. Sometimes, the most ordinary decisions, like boarding a flight or chasing a dream, carry consequences no one could ever imagine. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, there's a whole playlist waiting for you. Until next time. On the 20th of June, 2004, the dinner rush was in full swing at a seafood restaurant in Orange County, California. In the middle of the chaos, a frantic customer rushed in asking about a takeout order. The manager quickly grabbed the food and brought it to the counter. But as he rang the customer up, he noticed something strange. The customer kept glancing nervously over their shoulder toward the door, their fingers tapping anxiously against the countertop. And the second the transaction was finished, the customer grabbed the food and literally sprinted out of the restaurant. The manager just stood there for a moment, watching them disappear into the night. In all his years working there, he had never seen anybody run out of the restaurant like that before. But within seconds, another phone started ringing, another customer stepped up to the counter, and the strange encounter was quickly forgotten. That is, until a few days later when police officers showed up at the restaurant and asked the manager to describe that customer in as much detail as possible. On Monday, the 21st of June 2004, 72-year-old Jane Thompson was driving her car through the quiet, sun-drenched streets of Laguna Niguel, California. She was on her way home from a weekend trip up in Los Angeles, which was about 50 miles north. And for Jane, this drive was always a welcome part of the trip. LA was chaotic, a whirlwind of activity and constant noise. This drive home was her time to be by herself, to let the silence settle in, and to just decompress from the energy of the big city. Jane used to be a part of that world. She had lived in Los Angeles for decades, building a very successful career in the film industry. She had moved to Laguna Niguel about 7 years earlier after she retired, and the move had been a total lifestyle change. Her career in LA had been fast-paced, demanding, and exciting. She had started as an assistant to some very important people in Hollywood, then became an award-winning producer, and later a sought-after decorator for various Hollywood celebrities. It was a glamorous life, filled with parties and premieres and powerful people. And even though Jane was at her core a pretty quiet person who really appreciated her alone time, like she was right now, it had still been a tough transition. It was hard to leave behind the glitz of Hollywood for the slow, relaxed pace of a suburban community. A big part of that difficulty was because her girlfriend, Marion Reese, still lived up in LA. Jane had known Marion for decades. Their story started professionally. Marion owned a production company, and Jane had produced a lot of successful projects for her. They were great colleagues, then they became good friends. And then, at some point years ago, that working friendship blossomed into a full-blown romance. They had been deeply involved ever since. And even though they now lived over an hour's drive apart, they made it work. They saw each other all the time, spending weekends together either in LA or Laguna Niguel. In fact, Jane was already planning to head back to LA again that coming Friday. They had tickets to the opera, which was one of their favorite things to do together. And then, just a week after that, Marion was going to be joining Jane for a long-awaited cruise to Europe. It was going to be the trip of a lifetime for them. But for now, Jane was just enjoying the drive, looking out her window at the familiar scenery. As she passed a cluster of houses, she saw a familiar face. It was her friend, Mary Larkin, out in her front yard tending to her garden. Jane had known Mary for years. Since moving to Laguna Niguel, Mary had become her closest friend in town. They had spent countless nights sitting on one of their patios, talking for hours and sharing a bottle of wine. Sometimes, Mary's next-door neighbor, Karen, would join them, and she had become a close friend to Jane as well. So naturally, Jane slowed her car down, rolled down the window, and called out a friendly hello. She reminded Mary that they were overdue for one of their wine nights, and that they had to have one soon before she left for her big cruise. Mary looked up from her flowers, smiled, and nodded enthusiastically. She promised she would definitely give Jane a call to set something up. After they said their goodbyes, Jane put the car back in drive and continued on her way. A few minutes later, she saw the entrance to her condo complex up ahead. She put on her blinker and turned in. Soon, she was surrounded by rows of mostly identical units with their distinct orange-tiled roofs, all packed closely together on a quiet hillside. Jane absolutely loved her neighborhood. It was peaceful, it was less than 4 miles from the ocean, and she just felt completely safe and comfortable there. It was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked, a place where everyone seemed so warm and welcoming. And that sense of community meant the world to Jane. She didn't have any children or any living relatives. In many ways, she was on her own. So it was a wonderful feeling to know that her neighbors were all looking out for her. As Jane pulled her car into her garage and stepped out, she looked across the street and saw her teenage neighbor, Sam Nelson, shooting baskets in his driveway. Jane smiled and tried to get his attention, raising her hand to wave a simple hello. But when the boy looked over and saw her, his face fell. He immediately put his head down, dropped the basketball, and quickly rushed inside his house, slamming the door behind him. Jane sighed. She understood why he was acting that way. He was clearly deeply embarrassed. You see, Sam was what some people might call a troubled kid. And just this past Friday, while she was out, he had broken into her house and taken some of her jewelry. But Sam wasn't as clever as he thought he was. Jane had a good idea of who was responsible, and it didn't take her long to figure out for sure that it was him. So, before she left for her weekend trip to LA, she had gone over and confronted him about it. She told him she knew what he did and that he was never to do it again. The boy was obviously mortified, completely ashamed of being caught. But Jane had also told Sam something else. She told him she wasn't going to call the police. After all, Sam was only 15 years old. He had just made a really dumb mistake. And in Jane's mind, Sam was a part of her beloved community, and even though he had done something wrong, something that violated her home and her trust, she still wanted to look out for him. Plus, if she was being honest with herself, he hadn't taken anything that was particularly valuable or anything she couldn't live without. So, she felt like she was just giving him a second chance. It wasn't a big deal. At the time, Sam was obviously very appreciative. You could see the relief wash over his face when he realized he wasn't going to get in any real trouble. But it was also clear now that he wanted absolutely nothing to do with Jane. Just the sight of her waving at him was enough to send him running in shame. But for Jane, she figured maybe that was for the best. And so, after watching Sam disappear into his house, she just shrugged, turned around, and headed inside her own home. Jane spent the next few days settling back into her routine. She did her volunteer shift at the local library, she went on long walks with her weekly walking group, and she prepared for her upcoming trips. And before she knew it, it was Thursday evening, June 24th, and it was almost time to head back to LA. That night, the night before she was set to leave, Jane stood in her kitchen making herself a simple pasta dinner. As she stirred the sauce, she thought about what outfit she was going to wear for the opera with Marion the next night. After she ate, she cleaned up her dishes and then settled onto the couch in the living room to watch some television. Her plan was to only watch a little bit, maybe an hour or so, and then get some packing done for her trip. But she was tired from the week, and pretty quickly she felt her eyelids getting heavy. Soon, she was fast asleep right there on her couch. 3 days later, on a Sunday afternoon, Jane's friend and neighbor, Mary Larkin, the woman she had seen in the garden, drove up to Jane's house. Their other friend, Karen Hamara, was in the passenger seat. As they got out of the car, Mary could feel an undeniable knot tightening in her stomach. It was a feeling that had been growing steadily all day, ever since Jane's girlfriend, Marion Reese, had called her from LA. Marion had sounded panicked. She said that Jane had never shown up in LA for their opera date on Friday, and now she wasn't answering any of her phone calls. Marion had called over and over, but every call went straight to the answering machine. When Mary heard this, she immediately became very worried. It just wasn't like Jane. She was reliable. She was considerate. She would never just flake on people, especially not Marion, without calling to explain why. And given Jane's age, Mary's mind immediately went to the worst-case scenarios. Maybe she had fallen. Maybe she'd had some kind of medical emergency at home and couldn't get to the phone. Maybe she was hurt and needed help. That would explain why nobody could get in touch with her. So after she hung up with Marion, Mary tried calling Jane a few times herself, but she got the same result, the answering machine. With her anxiety growing, Mary had gone over to her neighbor Karen's house and asked her if she would come with her to Jane's condo just to check on her and make sure she was okay. On their short drive over, Mary had tried to convince herself that everything would be fine, that there was a simple explanation for all of this. But now, as she walked up Jane's driveway, that knot in her stomach tightened even more. She could see a few newspapers, still rolled up in their plastic sleeves, piled up at the end of the driveway. That was not a good sign. It meant Jane hadn't been outside to get them for at least a couple of days. So Mary hurried right up the driveway, went to the front door, and started knocking loudly. She and Karen stood there on the porch, listening, but they couldn't hear a single sound coming from inside the house. No television, no movement, nothing. Nobody was coming to the door. Finally, after a few minutes of knocking and calling Jane's name, they gave up on the front door. They left the porch and decided to walk around to the back of the condo to try the back door. And when the two women got into Jane's small, tidy backyard, Mary froze. She could see the sliding glass door that led into Jane's living room. And it was clearly, undeniably, wide open. It wasn't just unlocked, it was slid open several inches. Mary and Karen stood there in the yard and just started yelling through the open door, calling Jane's name over and over, hoping for any kind of response. But all they heard was silence. Eventually, Karen took a hesitant step towards the open door, as if she was going to go inside to look for their friend. But Mary instinctively reached out and grabbed her arm. "Don't," she said, her voice shaking. Mary could barely think straight. Her mind was racing with terrible possibilities. But some gut feeling, some primal instinct, told her that they should not go in there. It just didn't feel safe. And so instead, the two women backed away slowly, left the backyard, and went to go call the police. A few minutes later, Mary and Karen stood out on the street in front of Jane's house, watching as a police cruiser pulled up to the curb. The two women immediately went over to the two deputies who got out of the car and tried to explain the situation as calmly as they could. They told them that their friend wasn't answering her phone, that she had missed important plans, and that her back door was wide open, which was just so strange and out of character. They just didn't know what was going on, but they were very, very worried. The officers listened patiently, then asked Mary and Karen to show them this open door. So they all walked around the side of the condo and into the backyard. When they got there, Mary watched as one of the officers walked right up to the open sliding door. He didn't go in. He just stuck his head inside and began to look around. And as soon as he did that, Mary could see his whole body tense up. It was like he had seen something inside that immediately put him on high alert. Mary blurted out, "What is it? What's wrong?" But the officer looking into the home didn't respond to her. Instead, he pulled his head back out, turned to his partner, and spoke in a low, serious voice. There, he told him to secure the scene and call for backup. There was someone inside, and he could already tell they were deceased. About an hour later, at around 6 in the evening on the 27th of June, 2004, Detective Daniel Salado stopped his cruiser in front of a condo in Laguna Niguel, California. The call from dispatch hadn't given him much information, just that an older woman had been found dead in her home and that the circumstances were suspicious. When Salado got out of his car, he could see that the scene was already very active. There was yellow police tape stretched across the condo's front door and blocking off the driveway. Just inside that perimeter, he saw a uniformed officer speaking to two women who were crying and looked visibly distraught. Dozens of other officers and crime scene technicians were scattered around the property, beginning the slow, meticulous process of collecting evidence. One of the deputies saw Salado arrive and hurried over to give him an update. The deputy confirmed that the deceased woman had been identified as the owner of the condo, a 72-year-old, named Jane Thompson. And from the looks of it, it was not a natural death. It appeared she had been attacked. It looked like a murder. Her two friends, the two women who were still standing in the driveway talking to the police, had been the ones to call for a wellness check. The first responding officers had found Jane lying on the floor in her living room. They had been able to get inside through her sliding back door, the deputy explained, because the door was already open when they arrived. Salado glanced back over at the two crying women. He told the deputy to make sure they stuck around. After he took a look inside, he definitely wanted to speak to them. As the deputy hurried off to relay the message, Salado walked around to the back of the house. When he got there, he saw that not only was the sliding glass door open, but there were no obvious signs of a forced entry around the frame or the lock. That could mean a couple of things. Either it had been left unlocked, or maybe Jane had known her attacker and willingly let them into her home. Salado took a deep breath and stepped inside the condo. Right away, the scene was chaotic. Technicians were everywhere, dusting for prints, taking photographs, carefully documenting every detail. And what he saw was blood. There was blood spatter on the walls and on the furniture. And then, when he looked down at the floor, he saw Jane's body. She was lying face down, positioned between her couch and her coffee table. There was a large, dark pool of blood around her head. Salado crouched down next to her to get a better look. The wounds were brutal. Her head had been so badly pulverized that Salado could see parts of her skull, the actual bone, and he could see clear breaks in that bone. Her skull was shattered. Now, Salado knew he would have to wait for the official autopsy report to be sure, but to his experienced eye, it was very clear what had happened here. Somebody had taken some kind of heavy, blunt object and beaten this woman over and over and over again. A couple of minutes later, Salado stood back up. Based on the sheer extent of Jane's injuries, it seemed obvious to him that this was a frenzied, rage-filled attack. It was personal. And It had likely happened very, very quickly. Or maybe the attack happened in a way that Jane was completely caught off guard, because aside from the awful trauma to her head, she didn't appear to have any other wounds. There were no defensive injuries on her arms or hands. It didn't seem like she had tried to fight back or protect herself at all. And other than the blood spatter, the room around her showed no signs of a struggle. Nothing was overturned, nothing was broken. It was as if she was just standing or lying right here, and someone destroyed her, and the blood went everywhere. Salado left the living room and began to search the rest of her condo. He went into her bedroom, he searched her closets, he went through the small office, and he checked the kitchen. But there were no signs of anybody ransacking the place. There was no obvious theft that had taken place, at least not at first glance. He saw expensive electronics, a nice television, a stereo system, all still sitting out in the open. To Salado, at least right now, he was pretty sure this was not a simple robbery gone wrong. This felt different. As he was finishing his initial walkthrough of the condo, another officer called Salado back into the kitchen. When Salado went over, he saw the officer was standing by the landline phone's answering machine. The officer told Salado that there were a bunch of new, unplayed messages on it. He had checked the times, and the messages started on the morning of Friday, June 25th. Salado was immediately interested in that. It was a huge piece of information because it helped them start to build a timeline. If Jane had stopped answering her phone by Friday morning, then that meant she could have died sometime overnight on Thursday the 24th, or maybe even in the early morning hours before that first message came through on the 25th. At the very least, it gave them a window. Salado told the officer to be sure to log the tape from the machine into evidence. Then Salado went back to the living room where Jane's body was and where the technicians were still working. He just stood there for a moment, his arms crossed, thinking about his next move. Considering the attack had all the signs of being highly emotional, Salado felt confident that Jane's killer was someone who knew her, someone who was deeply, personally angry with her. So, the first people he needed to speak to were those who were closest to Jane, people like her family, her friends, or maybe even a romantic partner. Jane appeared to live alone, so he hoped that other people in the neighborhood, or maybe those two women who called the police, could tell him more about her personal life, her relationships, and give him a solid place to start his investigation. So Salado gathered a few officers, and they all headed outside to begin asking some questions. When he got back outside, Salado could see that a small crowd had formed. A group of what he assumed were residents of the complex were gathered at the edge of the police perimeter, watching the activity with concerned looks on their faces. Salado understood why. Brutal homicides like this one almost never happened in a quiet area like Laguna Niguel. He knew there was probably going to be a lot of panic and a lot of rumors spreading through this tight-knit community because of this. And based on the literal layout of the complex, the fact that all these condos were practically on top of each other, he knew that those rumors would likely spread very, very quickly. But there was a potential upside to that. The fact that these condos were so tightly packed together also gave Salado an advantage. It meant that it was very likely that somebody might have heard something or seen something that could help them break this case wide open. Just then, another police cruiser pulled up in front of the house, and a detective named Brian Sutton stepped out of the car. When Salado saw who it was, he immediately felt a sense of relief. Salado worked extremely well with Detective Sutton. They were a good team, and conducting interviews was their specialty. As a duo, they just had an instinct for asking the right questions, the kinds of questions that got people talking and opening up. So, Salado hurried over to Sutton and quickly brought him up to speed on everything he had learned so far. Once Sutton was briefed, they went right over to the two women who had called 911. Salado was eager to interview them as key witnesses. But he also wasn't ruling out the idea that they could be suspects. He was sure this had to be a personal crime, and these two women clearly had some kind of close relationship with Jane, since they were the ones who had come over to check on her. When Salado and Sutton reached the women, he could tell they had calmed down quite a bit from when he had first seen them. They were still upset, but they were composed enough to tell the detectives their names, Mary and Karen. They then explained that they were good friends with Jane and that they had come over to check on her because Mary had gotten a worried phone call from Jane's girlfriend, a woman named Marion Reese who lived in LA. They said Marion had been worried because Jane had not shown up in LA for plans they had, and so she was trying to find out where she was and if she was okay. This immediately made Salato's ears perk up. A girlfriend. He asked Mary for Marion's contact information. As he jotted down Marion's phone number, Sutton asked the two women where they were on the night of Thursday the 24th or the early morning of the 25th. Both women said they had solid alibis. Now, the detectives would still have to confirm those alibis because anybody can say they have one. But for right now, Salato was comfortable provisionally ruling Mary and Karen out as suspects. They both seemed genuinely stunned and horrified by Jane's murder. And while it seemed like they were good friends with Jane, he wasn't getting the sense that they had the kind of intense, complicated closeness that might have led to such a vicious and personal attack. So he told the two women they were free to go home. Then Salato nodded to Sutton, and the two of them left the women and headed towards the crowd of neighbors to ask some more questions. The next morning, on Monday, June 28th, Salato was behind the wheel of his cruiser with Sutton in the passenger seat. They were nearing the end of their long drive up to Los Angeles. Their destination was the home of Jane's girlfriend, Marion Reese. Salato was eager to get her statement because, at this point, they didn't have many other leads to go on. The forensics team hadn't found any usable DNA or fingerprints at the crime scene that could be tested against future suspects. And the canvas of Jane's condo complex the night before really hadn't yielded much either. They had learned that no one had seen Jane since Thursday, which backed up the timeline they had already established from the answering machine messages. But frustratingly, none of the neighbors had heard or seen anything strange or out of the ordinary on that Thursday night. And according to everyone they spoke to, Jane didn't have any obvious feuds or tension with anybody in the community. She generally kept to herself, but she was really well liked by everyone who knew her. But Salato, remembering the scene he had just witnessed, felt sure that someone out there had to have had a major problem with Jane. He had seen the preliminary autopsy report that morning, and it confirmed what he already suspected. Jane had died from the blunt force trauma wounds to her head. But it also told him something else. She had been hit more than a dozen times. It was complete and total overkill. And to Salato, that meant the killer had to have been driven by some kind of intense, overwhelming emotion, like pure rage or maybe even greed. Which was why they were now making this drive out to LA. They were going to speak with Marion, who Salato felt, based on her intimate relationship with Jane, was the strongest suspect they had. Romance, he knew, could make people do crazy things. And there was something else. Salato had done some digging into Jane's finances the night before, and he found out that she had a life insurance policy worth $100,000. And Marion Reese was listed as the sole beneficiary. That meant Marion definitely had something to gain financially from Jane's death. So, as they pulled up to Marion's house, Salato was thinking that maybe, just maybe, they had found their killer. A few minutes later, the detective sat on a couch in Marion Reese's living room. The home was on the smaller side, especially by LA standards, but it was very tastefully decorated. Marion sat down in an armchair across from them. When they looked at her, they could see her eyes were red and puffy, as if she had been crying for hours. She was holding a glass of water in her hand, and she kept lifting it up as if she was going to take a sip, but then she would just place it back down on the end table without drinking. It was like she was in a daze, just going through the motions. It was clear that someone, likely Mary or Karen, had already told Marion about Jane's death. And to Salato, she was showing every sign of being in genuine, profound shock. He knew he had to be very careful with his line of questioning. He didn't want to overwhelm her. If she shut down completely, he might not get the information he so desperately needed. After a moment of silence, Salato began by simply asking Marion how she knew Jane. Marion took a deep, shaky breath, and then, with a wavering voice, she explained that they had known each other for almost 50 years. She told them how they used to work together, how Jane had produced so many projects for her production company. As Marion continued to talk, describing how their professional relationship had slowly transitioned into a deep and loving romance, Soleto could sense that she was beginning to calm down a little. She was calming down to the point where he felt like he could now introduce the tougher questions. So he turned and gave a slight nod to Sutton. At that point, Sutton leaned forward and asked Marion if she was aware that Jane had named her as the sole beneficiary on her life insurance policy. When Marion heard the question, she gasped. She looked completely taken aback. She insisted she had no idea Jane had done that. But, she added, it did sort of make sense. She explained that Jane really didn't have any family to speak of, and that in many ways she, Marion, was her family. She was the closest relationship Jane had in the world. Now, Soleto felt like Marion's reaction to this news was very earnest, very genuine, but he couldn't be 100% sure. So he pressed her a little more. He asked her where she was last Thursday night, the night they presumed Jane was killed. But Marion didn't hesitate. She said she was with friends all night right there in LA. And she gave Soleto all the names and phone numbers of these friends so he and his partner could confirm her story. They talked for a while longer. Marion went over the details of how Jane had missed their opera date on Friday, and then how she had stopped returning her frantic calls. Her entire story lined up perfectly with what Jane's friend Mary had already told them. So eventually, Soleto and Sutton thanked her for her time and stood up to leave. Over an hour later, Detectives Soleto and Sutton were back in Laguna Niguel, parking their cruiser in front of Jane's condo once again. On their drive back from Marion's house in LA, the detectives had made some calls. They had spoken to several of Marion's friends, the ones she had given them the numbers for, and every single one of them confirmed her alibi. On the night Jane was killed, Marion was with them and she was in Los Angeles. And so now, Soleto had to admit that Marion was looking less and less like a viable suspect. So the detectives were back at Jane's condo to look into another working theory they had about what might have happened here. They were considering the possibility that Jane's murder was a hate crime. Remember, this was back in 2004, a time when being homosexual was not as widely accepted as it is today. And so their theory was that maybe one of Jane's neighbors had seen Marion visiting, or perhaps had heard about their relationship through the grapevine. And maybe they didn't like it. And maybe they had lashed out in a fit of violent prejudice. Strengthening this idea was the fact that it seemed to be common knowledge in the neighborhood that most people left their doors unlocked. It painted a picture of a community that was perhaps too trusting, making it easy for a neighbor with a grudge to slip inside Jane's home. However, Sutton and Soleto both knew that actually investigating this theory was going to be extremely challenging. There were 144 houses in this condo complex. Conducting a thorough investigation of every single resident of all of those houses was going to be a monumental task that would take a lot of time and manpower. But at this point, they didn't have any other options. They had to pursue every possible lead. So, the detectives got to work. They went to the first house next to Jane's and knocked on the door. A few hours later, Soleto and Sutton returned to the Orange County Sheriff's Department. They had spent most of the afternoon talking to people who lived in Jane's condo complex. And while they hadn't been able to talk to everyone yet, they already had to admit that their hate crime theory was looking more and more like a dead end. Most of the people they spoke to didn't even know Jane was in a relationship at all. Since her girlfriend Marion lived in a different city, they rarely saw her around. And beyond that, there was just nothing that anyone in the neighborhood said that made the detectives think that Jane was being targeted for any particular reason. But a few people had mentioned something interesting. They said that recently there had been a string of burglaries in the complex. This was something that was completely unheard of in a safe, quiet place like Laguna Niguel. Still, there was a huge difference between somebody breaking into a house to steal some stuff and breaking in and bludgeoning someone to death with such brutality. But it was a lead, a new thread to pull on. And that's what Soleto was thinking about as he and Sutton walked towards their desks. But before they even got there, Soleto had this sudden flash of insight, an epiphany. He just stopped dead in his tracks in the middle of the squad room. He turned to Sutton and said, "Turn around. We have to go back to the evidence room. I think everything we need to solve this case might be in this building with us right now." The following day, Salido and Sutton pulled up in front of a restaurant called the Beach House. The previous afternoon, after his epiphany, Salido had suggested that he and Sutton go back to the evidence room and listen to the tapes from Jane's answering machine one more time. Now, to be clear, they had already listened to the tapes before. But at the time, none of the messages had seemed particularly important or relevant. But now, based on what they had learned over the course of their investigation, they realized that those seemingly insignificant messages might actually tell them a lot. And so Salido and Sutton had spent hours re-listening to the tapes, transcribing them, and then gathering even more evidence to confirm what was on them. And even though they were now pretty sure that all this evidence they were gathering told them exactly who killed Jane, they still needed one more piece to fall into place. They had a book of photographs with them. It was a photo lineup. And they knew for a fact that one of the photographs in that book was of their killer. They just needed somebody in this restaurant to verify it for them. So, as soon as they got inside, they found the manager and explained why they were there. Then they asked him, "Hey, would you mind looking at these photos for us? See if you recognize anyone?" The manager looked a bit alarmed by the request, but he ultimately agreed to help. So they all went into a back room away from the customers. They opened up their book of photos and laid it on a table. The manager leaned over and looked. And almost immediately his finger shot out and he pointed to one of the pictures. And when Salido saw the person the manager was pointing to, he felt a grim sense of satisfaction. He knew they had finally cracked the case. Based on forensic evidence and eventually a full confession, here is what investigators believe happened to Jane Thompson in the early morning hours of the 25th of June, 2004. The killer, dressed in dark clothes and gloves and holding a hammer, stood in the darkness of Jane's backyard, right outside her sliding glass doors. The killer had already been to Jane's house a few times earlier that night. But each time they had approached, they had ultimately lost their nerve and left. Because every time they would get there, they would peek through the glass door and see Jane asleep on the couch in front of the television. And that was a problem. They needed Jane to leave the room. They needed her to go to her bedroom and go to sleep in there, out of the way. But she wasn't moving. But this time, as they stood outside the glass doors, they knew they had to go in. They knew if they didn't do it now, they would never get what they wanted from Jane, even if she was right there on the couch. So, the killer took a deep breath, reached forward, and tried the handle of the back door. It slid right open, just as they had expected. It was unlocked. Once the door was open, the killer stepped inside, very carefully, very quietly, and made their way over to the couch where Jane was sleeping. They just wanted to check to make absolutely sure that she was still asleep. But as the killer was hovering over Jane, looking down at her as she lay on her back on the couch, the unthinkable happened. Jane's eyes opened, and she looked right at them. The killer was so surprised, so utterly terrified of being caught, that they instinctively lifted the hammer they were holding and brought it down on Jane's head with all their strength. When the killer finally stopped and their adrenaline-fueled panic began to subside, they just stared down at Jane's destroyed body in total, numb shock. Then they backed away, and they realized that the hammer, the murder weapon, was dripping blood everywhere. So they grabbed the head of the hammer with their gloved hand to try and stop it from dripping, and then they turned and ran right back out through the sliding door. The killer hurried across the street in the darkness, and as they went, they tossed the hammer into a nearby trash can. And when they finally got to their own home, just steps away, they stripped off their bloody clothes, balled them up, and then tried to decide where to hide them. And as they stood there, trying to figure out what to do, they looked out their bedroom window at the house across the street, the house where they had just killed the one person in their life who had ever given them a second chance. It would turn out that Jane Thompson was murdered by a child. Her 5-year-old neighbor, Sam Nelson. Sam had actually broken into Jane's house more than once. He had been breaking in repeatedly and stealing all sorts of things from her, including her credit cards. And that was what the messages on her answering machine had been about. Jane's credit card company had been calling her back after she had reported a series of fraudulent charges on her account. And one of those charges was from that seafood restaurant, the Beach House, the one the investigators visited with the photo lineup. And the manager, when he looked at the photos, he instantly recognized Sam. Because Sam had been in there just a few days earlier, acting so frantic and strange. The reason Sam was stealing from Jane, and also from other people in the neighborhood, was ultimately because he was trying to keep up with appearances. He was using the stolen credit cards and money to buy food and expensive items that he thought would impress his wealthy classmates. On the night of Jane's murder, Sam claimed he did not go into her house with the intention of killing her. He said he just went in there with the intention of robbing her again. But for whatever reason, when she opened her eyes and saw him standing over her, he just panicked. He hit her once with the hammer. He said the blood went into his mouth, and his mind just went blank. And then, suddenly, he was beating her to death. Sam Nelson was arrested and eventually sentenced to 25 years to life in prison for the murder of Jane Thompson and also for multiple counts of burglary. His earliest eligible parole date is in the year 2027. He will be in his late 30s. Jane's friends and her partner, Marion, were left to grapple with an impossible reality. The kind, forgiving woman they loved had been murdered by a boy she was trying to help, a boy from the very community she had chosen for its safety and warmth. The unlocked doors of Laguna Niguel, once a symbol of trust, now served as a haunting reminder of how quickly a life can be shattered by a darkness hiding in plain sight. Thank you so much for watching. Jane spent her final days believing she had done the right thing by giving a troubled kid a second chance. And maybe that's the cruelest part of this entire story. Her kindness was real. Let me know what you thought about today's episode in the comments. And if you're ready for another true crime story, we have a full playlist waiting for you right now. Until next time, take care. We often like to think that we have a pretty good grasp on how the world works. We wake up in the morning, we go about our daily routines, and we assume that the boundaries of reality are solid and predictable. We go to the grocery store, we travel for work, we hang out with our families, and we watch television, expecting that everything will make perfect sense. But every once in a while, something happens that completely shatters that illusion. The solid ground beneath our feet suddenly feels incredibly fragile, and we are forced to confront events that seem like they were pulled straight out of a fictional thriller. The truth is that reality is often far more bizarre, terrifying, and mysterious than anything a writer could ever dream up. Today, we are going to dive into 5 strange but true stories that defy logical explanation. These are stories of chilling encounters in broad daylight, survival against absolute physical impossibility, warnings from places beyond our understanding, cruel psychological experiments carried out in secret, and a monstrous evil that managed to hide in plain sight on national television. To start, we have to travel back to February 17th of the year 2004. It was a cold afternoon in Wakachi City, Japan. Inside a massive, bustling superstore called Jusco, hundreds of shoppers were going about their normal routines. The air was filled with the typical sounds of a busy retail environment. You had the hum of fluorescent lights, the beep of cash registers, the murmurs of families discussing what to buy for dinner, and the gentle clatter of shopping carts. But suddenly, this peaceful, mundane atmosphere was completely shattered by a loud and aggressive commotion coming from the front of the store near a row of automated teller machines. When nearby shoppers stopped what they were doing and rushed over to see what was going on, they were met with a deeply unsettling sight. There was a thin young woman with a tiny baby strapped tightly to her chest, and she was locked in a violent, desperate struggle with an older man. At first, the onlookers just stood there in absolute shock. They did not know what to make of this. It was a chaotic scene, and they were trying to process who was the aggressor and who was the victim. But then, the young woman raised her voice and yelled out the word, "thief." The man she was grappling with was 68 years old, and he was clearly in a state of intense distress. He was a retiree, and in this moment he had been pinned up against a bank of ATMs by the sheer force of the struggle. His hands were clenched into tight, defensive fists, as if he was desperately holding on to whatever it was he had supposedly taken from the woman. Seeing a young mother with an infant in danger, 3 men from the gathering crowd decided they had to intervene. They lunged forward, grabbed the older man, and wrestled him away from the woman, pinning him face down onto the hard floor. Even though he was outnumbered and held down, the older man refused to open his hands. The 3 bystanders began screaming for the police, who happened to be patrolling nearby in the shopping center. The officers ran over, immediately jumped on top of the older man, and forced handcuffs onto his wrists. All the while, the man was lying on the ground, crying out and pleading with them, saying over and over that he had done absolutely nothing wrong. But then, his voice changed. Onlookers would later report that he began making a series of very strange, guttural moaning sounds. Before anyone could figure out what was happening to him, the man began violently vomiting, and within seconds, his body went completely limp as he lost consciousness. An ambulance was called, and while the police officers were waiting for emergency services to arrive, they decided to pry open the unconscious man's clenched fist to see what he had stolen. But when they finally managed to force his fingers open, they did not find a stolen wallet or a wad of cash. The only thing he was clutching was his own bank card, which was now severely bent in 3 different places from the force of his grip. The police searched his pockets and found his wallet, which belonged entirely to him. They also looked through the shopping bags that were scattered on the floor around him, but those bags only contained basic pet supplies, specifically some hamster food that he had just purchased. There was absolutely no evidence that this man had taken anything from anyone. At this point, the police realized they needed to speak to the victim to find out what had actually happened. They looked up from the unconscious man on the floor and began scanning the crowd of onlookers for the young woman with the baby. But she was gone. In the chaos of the struggle, the arresting officers, the bystanders, and the crowd had been so focused on subduing the older man that nobody had kept an eye on her. The police asked the crowd if anyone knew who she was or which way she had gone, but everyone just shook their heads. Nobody had paid attention to her departure. The police officers thought it was certainly a bit strange that a victim of a robbery would just walk away without waiting to speak to law enforcement, but they figured she was probably just shaken up and wanted to get her baby out of a stressful situation. Since she was gone and the suspect was unconscious, they decided to classify the whole incident as an attempted robbery and essentially put it to the side for the moment. But the situation grew far more serious the very next day. While still in the hospital, the 68-year-old retiree died. The medical examiners determined that his cause of death was heart failure, which had been brought on by the extreme physical and psychological stress of the altercation and the subsequent arrest. When the police received this report, they simply updated the case file to reflect that the suspect had passed away, and they prepared to close the investigation permanently. However, the family of the deceased man, who was referred to in police reports as Mr. A, completely refused to accept this outcome. They were devastated, and they knew in their hearts that Mr. A would never have attacked a young woman, let alone a mother with a baby. He was a gentle, quiet retiree who had spent 40 years of his life working dedicatedly for a chemical manufacturing company. He was currently collecting a modest pension and worked part-time as a security guard just to keep himself busy. He lived a peaceful life with his wife, his children, and his grandchildren in a house located just about a kilometer away from the Jusco store. On the afternoon of his death, he had walked to the store for the sole purpose of buying food for his grandson's pet hamster. His family went to the police and begged them to reopen the case. They insisted that Mr. A was not a criminal and that the mysterious woman must have done something to provoke him or start the fight. The police initially brushed them off, but the family was so persistent that the department finally agreed to a compromise. They said they would review the store's closed-circuit television security footage from that afternoon just to make sure they had not missed any crucial details. And when the investigators sat down to watch that footage, what they saw completely terrified them. The security camera was positioned directly over the row of ATMs where the entire struggle had taken place. The footage showed that about 5 minutes before Mr. A even entered the frame, the young woman with the baby was already standing there. But she was not waiting in line, and she was not using an ATM. She was standing tucked away in a dark corner just off to the side, completely motionless. Her back was pressed against the wall, her head was tilted downward, and she was holding her baby strapped to her chest. She stood there like a statue, never moving a muscle, just staring at the ground. Then Mr. A walked into the frame. He carried several shopping bags on his arms. He walked up to one of the ATMs, inserted his card, withdrew some cash, and turned around to walk toward the exit. The moment his back was turned, the woman in the corner suddenly came to life. It was as if a switch had been flipped. She lifted her head, stepped out of the shadow, and walked directly toward Mr. A. As she passed him, she deliberately reached out and brushed her hand against his chest in a very swift, gliding motion. The footage showed that Mr. A had an immediate, instinctive reaction to being touched by her. He spun around and grabbed her arm, clearly trying to stop her or ask what she was doing. And that was the exact moment the struggle began, and she started screaming that he was a thief. It was absolutely clear from the security tape that Mr. A had not tried to rob anyone. He was completely innocent. The woman had set a trap for him, waiting in the dark corner for the perfect target, and had fabricated the entire robbery out of thin air. As the video continued, the investigators watched the three bystanders tackle Mr. A to the ground. They watched the police arrive and handcuff him. And then they focused their attention on the woman. During the absolute chaos of the arrest, while everyone's eyes were glued to the dying man on the floor, the woman simply stood up, adjusted the baby on her chest, and calmly walked into the crowd, blending in and disappearing. The police immediately launched a massive search through all the security footage from every single camera in and around the Juiceco superstore. They looked at the entrance cameras, the exit cameras, the parking lot cameras, and the street-level cameras. They analyzed hours of tape from before and after the incident. But they found absolutely nothing. There was not a single frame of footage showing this woman entering the store, nor was there any footage of her leaving. It was as if she had simply materialized in that dark corner next to the ATMs, waited for Mr. A, caused his death, and then vanished into thin air. To make matters even more frustrating, the police interviewed dozens of witnesses who had been standing just feet away from the struggle, but not a single one of them could provide a detailed or reliable description of the woman's face. It was as if their minds had completely blocked it out, or they had simply been too distracted by the violence of the struggle to register her features. But the investigators did not give up. They went back to the ATM camera footage and began playing it frame by frame, zooming in as much as possible. And after hours of painstaking analysis, they found one single second where the woman had looked directly up right into the lens of the security camera, exposing her face. But when the investigators saw her face on the screen, they were so deeply unsettled that they made a highly unusual decision. They decided to hide the image from the public. They did not release it to the media, and they did not show it to anyone outside the department for an entire year. They were genuinely concerned that if the citizens of Wakachi City saw this photograph, it would create widespread panic, and people would be too terrified to ever shop at the Juiceco store again. When the image was finally released a year later, the public understood why the police had been so hesitant. The woman's face was completely devoid of any human emotion. Her eyes were blank, hollow, and downcast, staring out with a chilling coldness. There was no anger, no fear, and no excitement on her face. Many people who saw the image compared it to a death mask, which is a plaster cast made of a dead person's face shortly after their passing. Others remarked that she did not even look like a living human being, but rather something artificial or ghostly. After seeing the footage and realizing that their loved one had been entirely innocent, Mr. A's family filed a lawsuit against the police department for their negligence in detaining and pinning him to the ground while he was clearly experiencing a fatal medical emergency. The family and the department eventually reached an out-of-court settlement, but money was never what the family truly wanted. They wanted answers. They wanted to know who this woman was, why she had targeted Mr. A, and what she had done to him to cause his sudden, violent death. But despite the wide release of the creepy photograph, no one ever came forward with any information. The woman with the baby was never identified. And now, she never will be. The statute of limitations for the case officially expired in the year 2011. Today, the mystery of the Jusco Phantom remains one of the most famous and unsettling unsolved cases in modern Japanese history. It is still debated in online forums where people share the eerie photograph and wonder what kind of force was standing in that dark corner on that cold afternoon in 2004. Now, we shift our focus to an entirely different kind of mystery, one that took place high in the sky over New South Wales, Australia in the year 2007. 35-year-old Eva Wisniewska was not your average athlete. She was a member of the German national paragliding team, and she was widely considered to be the absolute best female paraglider on the planet. Over the previous 2 years, she had competed in 10 of the world's most prestigious paragliding competitions, and she had walked away with the gold in 6 of them. She was incredibly driven, highly skilled, and determined to keep her title as the world champion. On the 24th of February 2007, Eva was on Mount Bora in Australia, preparing her high-tech paragliding gear. She was joined by about 200 other paragliders from all over the world. This was Eva's very last chance to get a training flight in before her first major high-stakes competition of the season, which was scheduled to begin the following week. She was completely focused and eager to get into the air. But as the pilots were lining up and checking their equipment, one of the event coaches walked out in front of the crowd to deliver a warning. He told them that a line of storm clouds had been spotted far to the north. However, the weather forecast for the area was highly ambiguous. The meteorologists could not tell if the storm was going to move directly over Mount Bora or if it would pass safely to the side. The coach told the pilots that the decision to launch was entirely up to them. They had to weigh the risks for themselves. Eva looked up at the sky. It was turning a heavy, dark shade of gray, but she decided that she could not afford to miss this training opportunity. She figured that if the weather started to look truly dangerous once she was in the air, she would simply cut her flight short and land safely in the fields below. The rest of her German teammates, however, were not willing to take that chance. They decided to stay grounded and monitor her progress from a chase van on the road. Because Eva took a little extra time to double-check her harness and her instruments, by the time she was ready to step up to the edge of the cliff, almost everyone else had already launched. She was one of only a few pilots left on the mountain. She strapped herself into her glider, took a powerful, determined run forward, and launched herself off the cliff, soaring gracefully into the sky. Down on the ground, her teammates tracked her path using GPS and kept in touch with her via a two-way radio. For the first part of her flight, everything was incredibly peaceful. The air was smooth, and Eva navigated along the rugged ridgeline of Mount Bora for about 12 miles. But as the ridge ended and she sailed out over the vast, flat Australian savanna, the situation took a sudden and terrifying turn. 2 massive thunderstorm clouds had rapidly developed directly in her flight path. One of the clouds was significantly larger than the other. The vast majority of the paragliders who had launched earlier in the day had already passed through this area before the clouds formed, so they were safe. But Eva and 2 other pilots, one from the Austrian team and one from the Chinese team, were now flying straight toward the danger. They had to make a choice. They could either land immediately in the rough, unpredictable terrain of the savanna, or they could try to navigate around the perimeter of the clouds. They chose to try and dodge them. They knew it was incredibly dangerous to fly anywhere near the bottom of these clouds because of a phenomenon known as an updraft. At the onset of a major storm, a massive column of warm air is sucked violently from the ground up into the atmosphere, feeding the clouds. If a paraglider gets caught in that column, they can be pulled upward like a leaf in a vacuum cleaner. So Eva and the other 2 pilots began flying aggressively away from the dark clouds, trying to find a clear path. But the storm was moving far faster than they could have anticipated. In a matter of seconds, the larger cloud overtook the smaller one, combining to form a massive 12-mile-wide cumulonimbus cloud. Suddenly, all three pilots were trapped inside the storm zone. The updraft of a cumulonimbus cloud is legendary among aviators for its sheer destructive power. It can easily tear aircraft apart, and it can last for over an hour. The Austrian pilot immediately realized the danger. He pulled down hard on one of his steering toggles, pointed his feet downward, and began a tight, aggressive spiral to force his glider down to the earth, successfully escaping the grasp of the rising air. As he was spiraling down, he looked back to check on the other two. He could not see the Chinese pilot, but he saw Ava. She was desperately trying to mimic his spiraling maneuver, but it was too late. She was already caught in the core of the updraft. The Austrian pilot watched in horror as Ava was pulled straight up, disappearing into the pitch-black heart of the cloud. By the time the Austrian pilot slammed into the ground, a ferocious storm had broken loose. Giant hailstones were pelting the earth around him. He scrambled for shelter in a nearby barn, pulled out his radio, and screamed to the ground crews that they had an extreme emergency. Inside the cloud, Ava was experiencing a nightmare. She was being hurled upward at an unbelievable speed of 60 feet per second. The wind was so loud and violent that it felt like she was standing next to a jet engine. She was completely blind, surrounded by absolute darkness, except for the blinding flashes of lightning that exploded mere feet away from her glider. She knew she was being dragged into the very center of the storm's eye. She managed to squeeze her radio button and send a desperate message to her team on the ground. She gasped out that she could not see anything, and then her radio went completely dead. As she rose higher and higher, the temperature plummeted, and she was pelted by hailstones the size of oranges. The pain was excruciating, and she fought with every ounce of her strength to keep her glider stable. But at those extreme heights, the air becomes incredibly thin. Soon, Ava began to suffer from hypoxia, a severe lack of oxygen to the brain. She could no longer think clearly, her vision faded, and she passed out. The updraft did not stop. It shot her unconscious body all the way up and out of the very top of the storm cloud. While she was finally out of the turbulent, wet air of the storm, she was now floating in an environment that was 50 degrees below zero. Almost instantly, everything on her body froze solid. Her face, her insulated gloves, her clothing, and the delicate fabric lines of her paraglider were covered in a thick layer of ice. At that altitude, there was virtually no oxygen to breathe, and she had no mask or tank. By every known law of human physiology, Ava Wisniewska should have died within minutes. Yet, she did not. Her heart kept beating, and she remained unconscious, floating helplessly above the storm for 45 long minutes. Then, the weight of the ice on her glider caused one side of the wing to collapse. Suddenly, Ava was sent into a violent, uncontrolled freefall. She was hurtling back down toward the earth at a speed of 90 feet per second, falling straight through the frozen, turbulent storm cloud for a second time. But, as she cleared the bottom of the cloud and entered warmer, denser air, a miracle occurred. The ice on her glider melted, and the rush of air caused the canopy to naturally inflate and open back up. The violent, jerking motion of the glider suddenly stopping her terminal velocity jolted Ava back to consciousness. She opened her eyes, completely disoriented and shivering uncontrollably. She was still high in the air, but she was below the storm. The updraft had finally dissipated. Weakly, she reached up, grabbed her steering toggles, and guided her frozen glider down to a rough crash landing in a grassy field. She curled her freezing body into a tight ball, reached for her radio, and called her team. When they heard her voice, they began to cry. They had been preparing themselves for the worst. The Chinese pilot who had been sucked into the storm with her had unfortunately been struck by lightning and killed. They had assumed Ava had met the same fate. Ava was rushed to the hospital where doctors braced themselves for severe injuries. But to their absolute astonishment, they found that she had survived almost completely unscathed. She had some deep bruises from the giant hailstones and some moderate frostbite on her face and ears, but she required no major surgeries. She was actually discharged from the hospital that very same day. Later, Ava and her teammates went back to the launch site to retrieve her equipment. They decided to plug her GPS tracking unit into a computer to see just how high the storm had carried her. When the data loaded onto the screen, the team stared at it in complete, stunned silence. The GPS log showed that Ava had reached a peak altitude of 32,634 feet. To put that into perspective, that is the exact cruising altitude of a commercial passenger jet. Ava had been floating in the open air, unprotected, at an altitude higher than the summit of Mount Everest, and she had lived to tell the story. Our third story takes us back to the early morning hours of the 10th of June, 1994, in the mountainous terrain of Northern California. A woman named Deborah Hoy was fast asleep in a guest bedroom at her relative's house in Sacramento. She and her husband had planned a lovely, relaxing, multi-day visit with their family. But at around 2 o'clock in the morning, Deborah suddenly jolted awake. She did not know why she was awake, but she was immediately gripped by an intense, overwhelming sense of panic. It was not a physical pain, but rather a psychological urgency, a deep, unshakable feeling that something was terribly wrong and that they had to leave the house immediately and drive back to their home in Lake Tahoe. Deborah turned to her husband and shook him awake. She explained the feeling, her voice trembling with anxiety. Her husband, who was exhausted, tried his best to reassure her. He told her that she had probably just had a vivid nightmare and that she was still half asleep. He urged her to close her eyes and try to go back to sleep, promising that if she still felt the same way in the morning, they would pack up and leave first thing. Deborah nodded and laid back down, but as she stared at the dark ceiling, the feeling only grew stronger. It was like a physical weight pressing down on her chest, a voice in her head screaming at her that they had to get on the road right that second. Finally, she could not take it anymore. She jumped out of bed, turned on the lights, and told her husband that they were leaving right now. Seeing that his wife was genuinely terrified, her husband reluctantly agreed to go. They quietly packed their suitcases, wrote a hasty note of apology to their relatives, slipped out the front door, and got into their car. The drive from Sacramento to Lake Tahoe requires navigating a notorious stretch of highway up in the mountains. One of the most dangerous parts of this route is a section known as Ballen Bend. It is an incredibly winding, narrow road with sharp, blind turns, flanked on one side by a towering rock wall and on the other by a sheer, steep drop-off down the side of the mountain. One wrong move or a moment of distraction, and a car would plummet into the deep ravine below. They had been driving through the pitch-black mountain air for about 15 minutes, with only their headlights cutting through the darkness, when they rounded a particularly sharp horseshoe bend. As the headlights swept across the right side of the road, Deborah, who was looking out the passenger window, spotted something lying on the shoulder of the highway just a few feet past the asphalt. At first, she thought it was just some discarded trash, a sleeping bag, or perhaps a dead animal that had been hit by a truck. But as their car drew closer, the headlights fully illuminated the object. Deborah gasped in horror. Lying there on the cold, dirty gravel was the body of a young woman. She was completely naked, lying on her side, and appeared to be totally motionless. Deborah turned to her husband and screamed for him to keep driving. Her husband, who had also caught a brief glimpse of the figure, was panicked. He asked if they should stop, if they should turn around and see if she was alive and needed help. But Deborah was absolutely hysterical. She was convinced that the body was a trap, a setup by some violent criminal hiding in the trees, waiting for an unsuspecting driver to stop so they could rob or kill them. She pleaded with her husband to just keep driving and find the nearest phone. Luckily, just a quarter of a mile down the road, they came across a forest ranger station. In the parking lot, there was a public payphone. They pulled in, and Deborah, her hands shaking, dialed the police. She explained exactly what she had seen on the shoulder of Ballen Bend. The dispatcher told them to stay put at the ranger station and wait for responding officers to arrive. A few minutes later, a police cruiser pulled into the parking lot. The officers listened to Deborah's story and then asked her husband to lead the way back up the mountain, stopping a safe distance before the sharp bend so they could investigate. The couple got back into their car, with the police cruiser following close behind. They drove back up the winding road, and as they approached the horseshoe turn, her husband pulled over onto the shoulder. The officers parked behind them, got out of their cruiser, and walked past the couple's car, disappearing around the bend with their high-powered flashlights. Deborah and her husband sat in their car, watching the beams of light sweep across the dark trees and the side of the road. But after several minutes, the officers walked back around the bend, their faces looking completely blank. They walked up to Deborah's window, and one of them told her that they had searched the entire area, but there was absolutely nothing there. There was no body, no clothes, no trash, and no signs of anyone having been on the shoulder. Deborah was stunned. She insisted that she was not crazy and that she knew exactly what she had seen. The officers were polite, but they told her that since there was no evidence of a crime, they had to clear the scene. They advised the couple to continue their drive home and try to get some rest. The officers drove back to their precinct, and as they were sitting in the break room discussing the strange call, another officer named Rich Strayer walked in. Rich was a veteran of the department, and when he heard them mention the name Ballen Bend, his ears immediately perked up. Rich knew that just a few days prior, a young mother named Christine Skubish and her 3-year-old son Nicky had been reported missing. They had been driving to a family member's house, and the last known tower ping from Christine's cell phone had placed her somewhere near Ballen Bend. Rich wondered if the woman Deborah had seen could have been Christine. The next morning, as soon as the sun came up, Rich got into his patrol car and drove out to Ballen Bend. He pulled over at the exact spot Deborah had described and began a foot search. Within minutes of walking along the shoulder, he spotted something small lying near the guardrail. He walked over and picked it up. It was a child's shoe. Rich felt a knot form in his stomach. He walked to the edge of the guardrail and looked down the steep vertical embankment. At first, all he could see was a dense canopy of pine trees and thick brush. But as he adjusted his eyes, he noticed a faint trail of broken branches and trampled leaves leading down into the ravine. And then he saw a glint of red metal far below. Rich scrambled over the guardrail and began a treacherous climb down the steep mountain slope. He tore through the thick brush, following the path of destruction, until he finally reached a small, flat clearing near the bottom of the ravine. There, crushed and battered by the trees, was a red 4-door sedan. It was the exact car Christine Skubish had been driving. Rich ran to the driver's side and looked through the shattered window. Inside the driver's seat was Christine, and it was immediately clear that she was deceased. Rich then looked over into the passenger seat, and his heart stopped. There, strapped into his car seat, was 3-year-old Nicky. He was pale, incredibly thin, and barely breathing, but his eyes were open. He was alive. He had survived for 5 days in the freezing mountain temperatures without food or water. Rich quickly pulled him from the wreckage, carried him up the mountain, and called for an emergency medical helicopter. At the hospital, doctors worked frantically to save the little boy. They later told Rich that if he had found Nicky even 1 or 2 hours later, the boy would have succumbed to severe dehydration and exposure. He had been found at the absolute last possible second. When the investigators began reconstructing the accident, they assumed that Christine had fallen asleep at the wheel, run off the road, and crashed down the embankment. They figured that at some point she must have survived the initial impact, crawled up the steep slope to the road, and laid down on the shoulder to seek help, which was when Deborah had spotted her. They believed she must have then crawled back down to the car to be with her son before she died. But when the coroner completed the autopsy on Christine, that theory was completely destroyed. The medical examiner proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that Christine had died instantly from massive head trauma the exact moment the car hit the trees, 5 days before Deborah and her husband had driven down that road. She could not have climbed up to the road, and she could not have been the woman Deborah saw lying on the shoulder. To this day, there is no logical explanation for what Deborah Hoy saw on that dark mountain road. The police searched the area thoroughly and confirmed that no other people or bodies were present. Yet, it was Deborah's highly specific police report that led Officer Rich Strayer to search the exact spot where little Nikki was dying in the ravine. Many believe that some supernatural force, perhaps a maternal instinct that transcended death itself, had manifested on the road to guide rescuers to the dying child. Now we move to a story that began in 1980, involving a young man named Bobby Shafron. Bobby was 19 years old, and he was on his way to Sullivan County Community College, located about 2 hours outside of New York City, to begin his very first semester of college. Bobby was incredibly nervous. He was a shy, quiet kid who had never been popular in high school, and he did not know a single person at this new school. As he pulled his car into the campus parking lot, he saw hundreds of students laughing, hugging, and carrying boxes into the dorm buildings. He felt a deep sense of isolation. He grabbed his backpack, took a deep breath, and began walking across the wide campus lawn toward his dorm. But as he walked, Bobby noticed something very strange. Every time he passed a group of students, they would stop talking and just stare at him. Some of them smiled warmly, and others began waving. Bobby figured they were just being exceptionally friendly to freshmen, so he smiled back. But then a young woman ran directly up to him, threw her arms around his neck, kissed him on the cheek, and told him she was so happy he was back. Bobby was completely confused. He gently pushed her away and told her that she must have the wrong person because he had never been to this school before. The girl laughed, rolled her eyes as if he was playing a joke, and walked away. Bobby continued into the dorm building, but the bizarre interactions only intensified. As he walked down the hallway, random guys were high-fiving him, patting him on the back, and welcoming him back for the year. Finally, as he was about to turn the corner toward his assigned room, a voice boomed down the hallway behind him, calling out the name Eddie. Bobby stopped and turned around. At the far end of the hall, a student was waving excitedly, yelling for Eddie to come over. Bobby walked up to the student and explained that his name was not Eddie, that he was a freshman named Bobby, and that there had clearly been some sort of massive misunderstanding. The student stared at him for a second, laughed, and told him that he was a funny guy before walking off. Bobby went into his room, shut the heavy door, and sat on his bed, feeling completely overwhelmed and deeply unsettled. He could not understand why an entire campus of strangers was convinced he was a guy named Eddie. A few minutes later, there was a loud knock on his door. Bobby opened it, expecting another confusing encounter. Standing in the hallway was a student he had never seen before. But the moment this student saw Bobby's face, all the color drained from his skin. The student began visibly shaking. He stared at Bobby for a long, silent moment and then asked him if he had been adopted. Bobby, taken aback by the highly personal question, said that yes, he had been adopted as a baby. The student then asked if his birthday was the 12th of July, 1961. Bobby's jaw dropped. He said yes. The student, whose name was Michael, grabbed Bobby by the shoulders. He explained that his best friend, a guy named Eddie Galland, had attended the school the previous year but had decided not to return this term. Michael told Bobby that he looked, spoke, walked, and acted exactly like Eddie. He told Bobby that they had to be identical twins. Bobby could hardly believe what he was hearing. He had spent his entire life believing he was an only child. Michael insisted they call Eddie immediately. They ran out to a campus payphone, Michael dialed the number, and when a voice answered, Bobby took the receiver. He introduced himself to Eddie, and as soon as Eddie spoke, Bobby felt a chill run down his spine. The voice coming through the earpiece sounded exactly like his own. Eddie was just as shocked, and he immediately invited Bobby and Michael to come to his house in Long Island. The two boys jumped into Bobby's car and drove for 2 hours through the night. When they arrived at Eddie's suburban neighborhood, they saw a house with every single light turned on, glowing in the darkness. As they walked up the driveway, the front door flew open. Standing in the doorway was Eddie Galland. Bobby and Eddie stared at each other in absolute, breathless silence. They were looking into a living mirror. They had the same hair, the same eyes, the same build, and the same expressions. Michael would later describe the moment as deeply emotional. The two brothers, who had been separated at birth, immediately embraced, laughing and crying at the same time. The story of their incredible chance reunion quickly caught the attention of a local newspaper called Newsday. A reporter was sent to interview the boys, and the paper published a heartwarming, feel-good article about the long-lost twins who had been brought together by pure coincidence. But then, the story took a turn from the highly improbable to the downright impossible. A young man named David Kellman was sitting in his home in Queens, New York, when his friends began calling him in a state of frantic excitement. They told him he needed to go buy a copy of Newsday immediately. They told him that there was an article about two identical twins, and that the photos of the twins looked exactly like David. David was skeptical, but he went down to the local corner store and bought the paper. When he looked at the front page, his heart skipped a beat. The two boys staring back at him were his exact double. But what really caught his eye were their hands. David had always been self-conscious about having unusually large, thick hands, and in the photograph, both Bobby and Eddie had those exact same hands. David read the article and saw that their birthday was the 12th of July, 1961, and that they had been born at the exact same hospital in Long Island where he had been born. He immediately realized that they were not just twins. They were triplets. David managed to get Eddie's phone number and dialed it. Eddie's mother answered the phone, and when David explained who he was, his birthday, and his adoption, she gasps and drops the phone, screaming to her family that they were coming out of the woodwork. A few days later, Bobby and Eddie drove to David's house. The moment all three of them were in the same room, any doubt disappeared. They were identical triplets. Within minutes of meeting, the three 19-year-olds were wrestling on the living room floor, laughing hysterically and talking over one another. It was a beautiful, joyful reunion that made headlines all over the globe. The triplets became instant celebrities. They were invited onto the most popular national talk shows, they were featured on the covers of magazines, and they were hounded by fans wherever they went. People were fascinated by the uncanny similarities between them. Despite being raised by three completely different families in different parts of New York, they all smoked the same brand of cigarettes, they had all competed in wrestling in high school, they all loved the same foods, and they even shared the exact same physical mannerisms and gestures. They decided to move into an apartment together in New York City, and they lived like rock stars. They went to the trendiest clubs, met famous celebrities, and eventually opened an incredibly successful restaurant in Manhattan called Triplets. But while the boys were enjoying their new life, their adoptive parents were growing increasingly angry. They had all adopted their sons through a highly prestigious and wealthy New York agency called Louise Wise Services. None of the parents had ever been told that their baby had brothers, let alone identical triplets. They felt that the agency had deliberately kept them in the dark and stolen their children's right to grow up together. The parents demanded a formal meeting with the executives of Louise Wise Services. When they sat down in the agency's grand conference room, they asked why the triplets had been separated. The executives coldly explained that it was simply too difficult to find a single adoptive home that was willing or able to take in three babies at once, so they had made the decision to separate them for their own good. David's father stood up and slammed his fist on the table, telling them that was complete nonsense and that he would have gladly taken all three boys if he had only been told the truth. But the agency refused to give any further explanation and abruptly ended the meeting. As the families were walking out of the building, Bobby's father realized he had forgotten his umbrella in the conference room. He turned around, walked back down the quiet hallway, and opened the door. But when he looked inside, he saw the very same executives who had just offered their cold, somber apologies. They had popped open a bottle of expensive champagne and were clinking their glasses together, laughing and celebrating. It was immediately clear to him that they were not sorry at all. They were celebrating having successfully lied to the families and protected some dark secret. The parents tried to hire several prominent law firms to sue the agency, but every single firm they contacted initially showed great excitement, only to call back days later and abruptly back out of the case, claiming a conflict of interest. The parents realized that Louise Wise Services had incredibly powerful, wealthy connections in New York, and that someone was putting pressure on the legal community to keep this secret buried. Eventually, the families hit a brick wall, and they had no choice but to try and move on. But as the years went by, the cracks began to show. The triplets, who had never experienced the normal, slow process of growing up together and learning how to navigate conflicts, began to clash over how to run their restaurant. The arguments became increasingly personal and bitter. Bobby eventually decided he had to walk away from the business, which deeply fractured the trio's bond. Eddie, who suffered from undiagnosed mental health issues, was devastated by the falling out. He desperately wanted his brothers to be close, and the stress of the fracture sent him into a spiral of severe depression. After a brief stay in a psychiatric hospital, Eddie tragically took his own life. It was in the wake of this tragedy that a brilliant investigative journalist named Lawrence Wright began looking into the case. During his research, he stumbled across a highly obscure, dusty scientific paper tucked away in an academic journal. The paper detailed a secret, long-term psychological study involving identical twins and triplets who had been intentionally separated at birth and placed with different families. The paper revealed that all the children in the study had been sourced from the exact same agency, Louise Wise Services. Lawrence contacted Bobby and David and delivered the shocking news. They had not been separated because it was hard to find a home for 3 babies. They had been separated on purpose from the moment they were born to be used as human lab rats in a highly unethical, secret scientific experiment. The study had been designed and run by a prominent New York psychologist named Dr. Peter Neubauer. The goal of the experiment was to solve the age-old scientific debate of nature versus nurture. Dr. Neubauer wanted to see if a person's personality, intelligence, and mental health were determined entirely by their genetics, or if their environment and upbringing could change who they became. To achieve this, the triplets had been deliberately placed into 3 completely different socioeconomic households. Bobby was given to a very wealthy, highly educated family where the father was a doctor. Eddie was placed with a stable, middle-class family where the father was a strict teacher. David was placed with a warm, loving, but low-income immigrant family where English was a second language. Every year of their childhood, researchers from the study would visit each of the boys' homes under the false pretense that they were just conducting routine, standard follow-up visits for the adoption agency. They would film the boys, administer cognitive tests, and take detailed notes on their behavior. The parents had no idea that their sons were being compared to 2 identical brothers living just miles away. Even worse, the researchers had actually used the family's first adopted children as a sort of baseline, studying how the parents raised them before placing the triplets into the homes, essentially turns the parents themselves into unwitting test subjects. When Lawrence Wright tried to interview Dr. Neubauer about the study, the psychologist refused to answer any questions and showed absolutely no remorse. He had never published his final findings, and before his death in 2008, he had ensured that the entire study, including all the video footage and records of the triplets' childhoods, was legally sealed in the archives of Yale University until the year 2066, long after the surviving triplets would be dead. In a recent documentary about the case, Dr. Neubauer's former assistant claimed that the study had proved that nature was far more powerful than nurture, and that the boys were genetically predisposed to their behaviors. But many critics pointed out the ultimate tragedy of the study. Eddie, who had been raised by a cold, strict father, had succumbed to depression and suicide, while his brothers, raised in warmer homes, had survived. This suggested that nurture did indeed play a massive critical role, and that the separation itself had caused irreparable psychological harm to all 3 boys. To this day, Bobby and David have never received a formal apology or a full explanation of what was done to them. The secrets of their lives remain locked away in a university vault, a chilling reminder of how far some are willing to go in the name of science. For our 5th and final story, we go back to a milestone night in American television, the 18th of December, 1956. This was the night that a revolutionary new game show called To Tell the Truth made its very first broadcast. The setup of the show was incredibly engaging. The audience and a panel of 4 celebrity judges would be introduced to 3 contestants, all of whom claimed to be the exact same person. This person was always someone remarkable, someone who had accomplished an extraordinary feat, possessed an unbelievable talent, or lived a highly unusual life. Only one of the 3 contestants was the actual, real person. The other 2 were imposters, coached by the show's producers to lie, manipulate, and trick the judges. The celebrity panel would have a few minutes to ask the contestants questions about their biography to see who would slip up. At the end, the judges would vote on who they believed was telling the truth, and the host would ask the real person to stand up, resulting in massive applause from the studio audience. The show was an absolute sensation, and it remained a staple of American culture for decades. But of all the thousands of episodes that have aired over the years, there is one particular broadcast from October of 1972 that will forever be remembered as deeply chilling. On that evening, 3 middle-aged men walked onto the stage and introduced themselves to the panel as Ed Edwards. The host then read the biography of the real Ed Edwards. It was a fascinating, dramatic story. The host explained that Ed had once been an incredibly dangerous criminal, a man who had landed himself a spot on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list for a series of daring armed robberies and for impersonating a federal officer. But, the host continued, while Ed was serving a long sentence in a maximum security prison, a compassionate guard had taken him under his wing and helped him reform. Upon his release, Ed had dedicated his life to being a model citizen. He had written a best-selling book about his life and had become a highly sought-after motivational speaker, traveling the country to teach people how to spot con men and protect themselves from criminals. The celebrity judges began questioning the 3 men, trying to poke holes in their stories about prison life and criminal tactics. After the interrogation was over, the judges cast their votes. Finally, the host spoke the famous line, asking the real Ed Edwards to please stand up. A man in a sharp suit, with a warm, friendly smile and a perfectly groomed haircut, stood up. The crowd erupted into applause. He looked like the absolute definition of a wholesome, suburban American father. He looked like a man who could not hurt a fly. But, decades later, the world would learn the horrifying truth about the man who stood up on that stage. In the year 2009, a 40-year-old woman named April Balacio was lying in her bed, unable to sleep. April was Ed Edwards' daughter. And for her entire life, she had been haunted by a deep, dark suspicion about her father. Despite his public image as a reformed, peaceful family man, behind closed doors, Ed was an absolute monster. He was incredibly violent, physically abusive, and a pathological liar. April remembered that during her childhood in the 1970s and 80s, her father would suddenly force the family to pack up all their belongings in the middle of the night and move to a different state with absolutely no warning. Whenever April or her siblings asked why they had to keep running, Ed would claim that because he had been a police informant during his time in prison, old associates had discovered their address, and they were in imminent danger. April never believed him. She always felt that they were running from something far more sinister. So, on that night in 2009, April opened her laptop and decided to do some digging. She began making a list of all the random small towns they had briefly lived in during her childhood. She typed the name of each town into Google, followed by the words unsolved murder or unsolved mystery. As she scrolled through the search results, she stopped at a case from 1,980. It was an unsolved double homicide in the town of Watertown, Wisconsin. April's heart began to race. She knew for a fact that her family had lived in Watertown in 1980 during the exact month of the murders. She read the details of the crime. A teenage couple, Tim Hack and Kelly Drew, had disappeared from a wedding reception. Their bodies were found weeks later in a nearby field. They had been brutally murdered. The police had released a description of a suspicious man seen near the reception, and as April looked at the sketch, she realized it looked exactly like her father. April made a brave, agonizing decision. The next morning, she called the Watertown Police Department and told them she believed her father was responsible for the cold case. The police took her tip seriously. They tracked down Ed Edwards, who was now an old man living in a trailer in Kentucky, and obtained a sample of his DNA. When the lab results came back, it was an absolute match. Ed Edwards' DNA was all over the evidence from the 1,980 crime scene. Ed was arrested and extradited to Wisconsin. Once he was in a small interrogation room, the facade of the reformed citizen completely shattered. He quickly confessed to the murders of Tim and Kelly. But then, he did something even more bizarre. He began demanding that the state execute him. He wanted the death penalty. When the prosecutors told him that Wisconsin did not have the death penalty and that his maximum sentence would be life in prison, Ed grew incredibly frustrated. He wanted control over his own death. So, to force their hand, he confessed to another double murder from 1,977 Inches, Ohio, where he had killed another young teenage couple, Billy Lavaco and Judy Straub. But due to a legal loophole, the Ohio charges still did not guarantee his execution. Outraged, Ed finally revealed a fifth murder. In 1996, he had murdered his own 25-year-old foster son, Danny Boy Edwards, in order to collect a massive life insurance payout. Because of the financial motive and the nature of the crime, this finally made him eligible for capital punishment. Ed was sentenced to death, just as he had wanted. However, he would die of natural causes in prison in 2011, just weeks before his scheduled execution. Since his death, cold case detectives and criminal investigators have realized that Ed Edwards was almost certainly one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Many experts believe he is responsible for dozens of unsolved murders across the country, spanning from the 1950s all the way to the 1990s. There is even a highly compelling theory, supported by some law enforcement officials, that Ed Edwards was the Zodiac Killer, the infamous unidentified monster who terrorized Northern California in the late 1960s. If that theory is correct, it means that when Ed Edwards walked onto the stage of To Tell the Truth in October of 1972, he was not a reformed man who had put his past behind him. He was an active, cold-blooded serial killer. As he stood before the bright studio lights, smiling and waving to the cheering audience, he had already taken the lives of multiple innocent people. He had used a national television show to feed his massive ego, playing a game of lies in front of millions of viewers, while his victims lay buried in shallow graves across the country. These 5 stories, as different as they are, all share a deeply haunting common thread. They show us that the world is a far more mysterious, unpredictable, and sometimes terrifying place than we dare to admit. They remind us that the stranger walking past us in a crowded store, the sudden urge that saves a life, the scientific institutions we trust, or even the smiling face on a classic television screen can hold secrets that defy explanation. So what do you think? Which of these stories unsettled you the most? Because the truth is, stories like these don't just exist on the internet. They happen in real life. Sometimes they happen a lot closer than we'd like to believe. Maybe don't watch it alone.